Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight you're stepping into a world that no longer exists. Not entirely anyway. It is somewhere in the 18th century. The exact year does not matter yet. What matters is the hour. It is late. It is quiet. And somewhere in a city you have never visited, a city of cobblestones and lamplight and long philosophical arguments that stretch past midnight, someone is preparing for bed. They are blowing out a candle. They are pulling a heavy curtain across a cold window. They are lying down in a bed that smells of lavender and old linen, in a room that holds the particular silence of a world that has not yet invented electricity, or alarm clocks, or the kind of noise that never truly stops. And tonight, you are going to follow them. You are going to move slowly through the sleeping world of the Enlightenment, through the bedchambers of philosophers and servants, through the dormitories of academies and the crowded quarters of sailors on dark Atlantic water, through the perfumed salons of Paris and the candlelit studies of men who were trying, desperately and beautifully, to understand everything. This is not a story of battles or revolutions, not exactly. It is a story of the quiet hours, of what people thought about as they closed their eyes. Of how they understood sleep itself, that strange, necessary disappearance that takes us all, every single night, no matter who we are or what century we inhabit. So settle in. Let the room around you grow a little softer. There is nowhere you need to be for the next few hours. We are going slowly tonight. Ambient deepens slightly, the sound of a distant church bell, one single toll, then settling back into quiet before we begin, a small and gentle note. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of storytelling, slow, careful, the kind that lets history breathe, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more evenings like this one waiting for you, more quiet centuries, more forgotten rooms. And now, with no further interruption, we go back. What the Enlightenment thought it knew about sleep: ambient, soft fire crackling, distant city sounds, quill scratching on parchment. The 18th century had opinions about everything. This was, after all, the Age of Reason, the age of the encyclopedia, that enormous, audacious French project to write down all of human knowledge in alphabetical order, to organize the universe into volumes that could sit on a shelf and be consulted by anyone who could read. The age of Newton's laws being discussed in drawing rooms, of electricity being pulled from lightning by curious men with kites, of the human body being mapped and measured and argued over in universities from Edinburgh to Vienna to Philadelphia. The Enlightenment, broadly speaking, ran through most of the 1700s, though historians argue about exactly when it began and when it ended, as historians tend to do. What most of them agree on is this: it was a period when educated Europeans became convinced that the world could be understood through observation and reason, that superstition and tradition were not good enough answers anymore, that things had causes, and those causes could be found and written down and shared. And so naturally, they turned this spirit of inquiry towards sleep. Sleep was, after all, a mystery of the first order. Every human being spent roughly a third of their life in it. It was universal and inevitable and deeply strange. You lay down, closed your eyes, and for several hours you were what exactly? Not quite conscious, not quite unconscious, somewhere else entirely. You saw things that were not there. You felt things that were not happening. You woke up and sometimes you remembered these experiences vividly, and sometimes they dissolved the moment you opened your eyes like breath on cold glass. What was that? Where did you go? What happened to the rational, observing self during those hours? These were questions the Enlightenment very much wanted to answer. The trouble was that the answers kept slipping away. Let us begin in a specific place. A study late at night. The city outside is London, specifically, somewhere in the winding streets near Fleet Street or the Strand, in the middle decades of the 18th century. The study belongs to a physician. He has been working for several hours by candlelight, and the candle has burned low, and the room smells of tallow and old books and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco from earlier in the evening. On his desk is a manuscript, a treatise on the nature of sleep. He has been writing it in pieces for the better part of 3 years. He is a careful man, methodical. He does not like to make claims he cannot support with evidence, though the word evidence means something different in this century than it will come to mean later. His name, for our purposes, does not matter very much. He is representative rather than singular. He stands for all the physicians and philosophers and naturalists who spent the 18th century trying to pin sleep down, to hold it still long enough to examine it properly. And what did he believe? He believed, as most educated Europeans believed in this period, that sleep was fundamentally a matter of the nervous system. The nerves, those delicate, invisible threads that ran through the body and carried sensation and motion, became, during sleep, somehow quieter, less agitated. The animal spirits, a concept inherited from ancient medicine, those fine, subtle fluids thought to flow through the nerves and animate the body, settled and stilled. The blood moved more slowly. The heart beat with a quieter rhythm. The eyes, those always busy instruments of perception, closed and rested. Sleep in this framework was a kind of voluntary retreat, the mind withdrawing from the noisy, demanding world of sensation. stepping back from the constant flood of information that poured in through the eyes and ears and skin every waking hour. It sounds almost peaceful, described that way, and to the physician in his candlelit study, it was. Sleep was not frightening or mysterious in a bad sense. It was necessary. It was natural. It was, he wrote, in language that rolled slowly across the page, one of the most eloquent proofs of the wisdom of nature, that the human machine required regular rest, that the Creator, if you were inclined to think in those terms, or nature, if you preferred the newer vocabulary, had built into the body a mechanism for renewal. He was not entirely wrong. He was just working with the tools available to him. A log shifts in the fireplace. The ambient becomes slightly warmer, slightly deeper. There were several competing theories of sleep in the 18th century, and it is worth sitting with them for a moment, because they reveal something interesting about how differently people can think about the same experience. The first and oldest theory was the one the physician believed, the theory of nervous exhaustion and recovery. The nerves became tired through use, as any working part might become tired, and sleep allowed them to recover. This was sometimes called the hydraulic theory, because it imagined the animal spirits as a kind of fluid that could be depleted and replenished. During the day, the spirits flowed outward, animating the muscles and feeding the senses. During sleep, they withdrew inward, pooling in the deeper recesses of the brain, restoring themselves for the next day's work. This theory had the advantage of feeling intuitively right. Everyone knew what it was to feel tired. Everyone knew the relief of lying down. And everyone knew that after a good night's sleep, you felt, in some fundamental way, refilled. The second theory was more mechanical and more recently arrived, influenced by the new enthusiasm for hydraulics and pumps and the circulation of fluids that followed Harvey's discovery of blood circulation in the previous century. In this version, sleep was caused by a slowing of the blood's movement to the brain. The brain, deprived of its usual supply of stimulating, oxygenated blood, became less active. Consciousness, which was somehow tied to this activity, faded. You fell asleep the way a lamp fades when the oil runs low. There were physicians who disagreed with this entirely. The Scottish physician Robert Witt, writing in the 1760s, spent considerable energy arguing that the soul, not the blood, not the nerves, but the soul was the true seat of consciousness, and that sleep involved some kind of temporary withdrawal of the soul's attention from the body. This was not a mystical claim exactly. Witt was a careful empiricist in most respects, but he was not willing to reduce consciousness to mere fluid mechanics. There was something else, he insisted. Something that could not be weighed or measured, but was nonetheless real. The third theory was stranger, and in some ways more interesting than either of the first two. It came primarily from the continent, from French and German thinkers who were fascinated by the relationship between sleep and what they called sympathy. The idea that the organs of the body were not independent machines, but deeply connected to each other, responding to each other's states. Sleep in this view was not just about the brain or the nerves. It was about the whole body agreeing, in some coordinated way, to slow down together. The stomach, full from the evening meal, sent signals of satisfaction to the brain. The muscles, tired from the day's exertion, communicated their fatigue. And the brain, receiving all these messages of tiredness from all directions, finally consented to rest. This was actually not far from what we now understand to be true, though the vocabulary has changed almost beyond recognition. But in the 18th century, it was just one theory among several, argued over in medical journals and coffee houses with equal passion and equal uncertainty. What is striking, sitting with these theories now, is not how wrong they were or how partially right. What is striking is the confidence with which they were held. The Enlightenment believed in the possibility of knowing things, of pinning the world down with words and measurements and careful observation. And sleep kept refusing to be pinned down. You could watch someone sleeping. You could note the movements of their chest, the fluttering of their eyelids, the occasional twitch of a dreaming limb. You could feel their pulse and find it slower. You could observe that they were harder to wake at some hours than at others. You could note that some people talked in their sleep and walked and did extraordinary things they would not remember. But you could not go where they had gone. Sleep, for all the Enlightenment's eagerness to explain it, remained stubbornly private. A territory that each person entered alone and left alone and could only describe in fragments afterward. The physicians and philosophers wrote their treatises. The candles burned lower. And in 1,000 different rooms across the cities and countryside of Europe, in London and Paris and Amsterdam and Vienna and Edinburgh, people lay down in their beds and slept, as they always had, as they always would, without needing a theory to explain why. The ambient shifts slightly, still warm, still quiet, but with the faint addition of wind moving through trees outside a window, suggesting the night is deepening. It is worth pausing here, before we move forward, to say something about how the Enlightenment related to the idea of sleep more broadly, not just as a medical question, but as a cultural one. The 18th century was in many ways an intensely wakeful civilization, or at least it aspired to be. The whole project of enlightenment, the reaching after reason, the questioning of received authority, The determination to see clearly and think clearly was a project of the waking mind. The light that philosophers kept invoking was not literal, of course, but it was not entirely metaphorical either. To be enlightened was to be awake, attentive, seeing, and so sleep sat in a somewhat awkward position in this culture. It was necessary, yes. Natural, yes. The physicians all agreed on that, but it was also, in some sense, a retreat from the very qualities the age most prized. You could not reason in your sleep. You could not observe or calculate or argue. You were, for those hours, in the grip of something you did not control. Dreams were particularly troubling in this respect. They came uninvited. They followed their own strange logic, ignoring the rules of cause and effect that the Enlightenment held sacred. They could be frightening, beautiful, ridiculous, obscene, and you had no say in the matter. The rational mind, so carefully cultivated, simply handed over its house keys every night to something much older and less tidy. We will spend time with dreams later in our story. They deserve their own chapter, their own candlelit room. But for now, let us simply note that the relationship between the Enlightenment and sleep was a little more complicated than it might first appear. The Age of Reason was also, quietly, an age of sleepers, and the sleepers had stories to tell. The beds of the Enlightenment, ambient, a clock ticking slowly, distant rain beginning to fall against a window, the sound of bed linen settling. Before we can understand how people slept in the 18th century, we need to understand where they slept. The bed in the 1700s was not always the private, solitary piece of furniture we tend to think of today. It was something far more complex, more social, more loaded with meaning, more variable in its forms and functions. And to understand this, we need to travel through several different kinds of rooms, in several different kinds of places, moving slowly and noticing everything. Let us begin at the top. In the great houses of England, those enormous Georgian and Baroque estates that still stand in the English countryside, somewhat implausibly, surrounded by manicured parkland and long gravel drives, the bedchamber was one of the most important rooms in the house, not because it was where people slept. Not primarily. The formal bedchamber of an aristocratic English or French household in the early and middle 18th century was above all a ceremonial space. It was the room in which the lord or lady of the house conducted the rituals of rising and retiring, the lever and the coucher, and these rituals were not private. They were performed in front of an audience. This practice had its fullest expression at Versailles, the vast palace that Louis XIV had built outside Paris in the previous century, and which continued to function as the center of French court life well into the 18th century. At Versailles, the king's morning rising, the grand lever, was an elaborate ceremony attended by dozens of courtiers. The king would wake and attendants would bring him his shirt, and lesser nobles would watch, because being invited to witness the king put on his shirt was a mark of royal favor. You were close to power, you were trusted, you were in that moment inside the innermost circle. It sounds absurd from a distance of 300 years, and perhaps it was, but the French court understood something profound about ceremony, that the performance of intimacy is itself a form of power. By allowing selected people to see him at his most vulnerable, in the first moments of waking, the king was not being exposed. He was being magnanimous. He was demonstrating that he had nothing to hide, that his life, even in its most private moments, was a matter of public order and public meaning. The French had a word for this, publicité, not publicity in the modern sense, but a quality of publicness, a life lived appropriately in front of others. And the bedchamber was where this quality was most dramatically enacted. The rain against the window becomes slightly more insistent, then settles into a steady, rhythmic sound. As you moved down the social hierarchy of the great house, the bedchamber changed character. The private apartments of the lord and lady, the rooms behind the ceremonial chambers, were more genuinely restful. These were smaller, lower ceilinged, furnished with an eye to comfort rather than display. The walls might be hung with silk damask in softer colors, pale greens, quiet blues, dusty roses. The curtains around the bed would be heavier, designed to keep out drafts and create a kind of portable darkness. The bed itself, in an aristocratic household of the 18th century, was a magnificent object. The four-poster, that tall, columnar structure with its canopy and curtains, was still the dominant form in England, though French fashion was moving toward lower, more horizontal shapes in this period. The posts were carved, sometimes gilded. The curtains might be of silk or wool or embroidered linen, and they served a purpose beyond decoration. Drawn closed on all four sides, they created a small, enclosed room within the room. A sleeping space that held the warmth of the body and shut out the cold drafts that moved through even the grandest stone houses in winter. Inside those curtains, it was very dark, very warm, very private. This was the inner chamber of the self, the place where, for a few hours, even the most public of lives could rest. The mattress was typically a palliasse, a sack filled with straw or rushes, topped by one or more feather mattresses, and then by pillows and bolsters and layers of linen sheets and wool blankets and silk counterpanes. The weight of all this bedding was itself a kind of comfort, a heaviness that pressed down gently and said, "You may stop now, you may be still." In the households of the middle classes, the merchants and attorneys and physicians and clergymen who made up the prosperous but not aristocratic layer of 18th century society, the beds were somewhat simpler, but the ritual of sleep was no less thoughtful. The middle-class bedroom of this period was typically a room of considerable intimacy and meaning. It was where marriages were consummated and children were born and the dying spent their last hours. It held the most personal objects of a household, the small portrait of a lost parent, the prayer book with the worn spine, the nightstand with its candle stub and water glass, and perhaps a small packet of dried lavender to sweeten the air. The middle-class bed was often a simple wooden frame with a tester, a canopy above it, and curtains that could be drawn for warmth and privacy. The mattresses were less sumptuous than in the great houses, but they were still carefully made and valued. A good mattress was an investment. You made it, or you had it made for you, and you expected to use it for decades. Husbands and wives generally shared this bed. This was not always a matter of romantic choice, though it sometimes was, but of practical warmth. Two bodies in a bed in a cold English or French winter were significantly warmer than one. The curtains drawn, the blankets piled, the breath of two people slowly warming the enclosed air. This was how the middle classes stayed alive through the months when frost formed on the inside of windows. Children slept nearby, sometimes in a trundle bed that pulled out from beneath the parents' bed, sometimes in their own small room. Sometimes in smaller houses, in more modest circumstances, in the same bed with one or both parents, a practice that would later disturb reformers, but that was in the 18th century, simply what families did. A clock somewhere in the building strikes 2. The rain continues, steady and unhurried. And then there were the servants. The servants of an 18th century household occupied a different world of sleep entirely. And it is worth spending time here, in these less celebrated spaces, because this is where most of the people were. A large aristocratic household might employ dozens of servants, footmen and maids and cooks and stable hands and laundry women, and under butlers and ladies' maids and grooms of all varieties. These people worked long hours, 12, 14, 16 hours a day was not unusual, and when they finally slept, they slept in whatever space the house had allocated to them, which was rarely comfortable and often crowded. Attic rooms were the most common servant sleeping quarters. Long, low-ceiling spaces tucked beneath the roof, cold in winter and sweltering in summer, with small windows that let in little light and less air. Multiple servants would share a room, sometimes a bed. Same-sex sharing of beds between servants was entirely normal in this period, entirely unremarkable. There was no particular intimacy implied beyond the simple economy of warmth and space. The mattresses in these attic rooms were rough palliasses, straw-filled ticks that prickled and crackled when you turned over. The blankets were coarse wool. The curtains, if there were any, were thin. The cold came up through the floorboards in winter, and the sound of wind in the roof slates was sometimes very loud. After 12 or 14 hours of work, carrying coal and fetching water and making fires and serving meals and scrubbing floors and ironing linen, you climbed these stairs, you lay down on this mattress, and you slept with a completeness and a speed that the masters downstairs, with their feather beds and their worries and their brandy, could only envy. There is something to be said for exhaustion as a sleep aid. The Enlightenment's physicians noted it, actually. They observed that the poor, on the whole, slept more soundly than the rich, that laborers fell asleep more quickly and woke more refreshed than scholars. This was attributed variously to the health-giving effects of physical exercise, to the simplicity of the poor man's diet, to the absence of the stimulating intellectual activity that kept educated minds churning long past the hour when they should have rested. There was perhaps some truth in all of these explanations. And there was perhaps also something simpler at work. When your body has been used hard all day, it does not need persuading to rest. Now let us leave the grand house entirely and move through the city. The cities of the Enlightenment, London, Paris, Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Vienna, Philadelphia, were dense, noisy, complicated places. They were growing at astonishing speed. London's population passed 1 million in this period, making it the largest city in Europe. Paris was not far behind. These were cities of constant motion, of trade and commerce and argument and spectacle, where the streets were crowded from early morning until very late at night with people going about the urgent business of being alive in the modern world. And in these cities, people slept in ways that would surprise us. The inns and taverns, and there were thousands of them, offered beds in the old, communal fashion. You paid for a bed, not a room. The bed you received might already contain 1 or 2 other travelers, strangers to you and to each other, simply sharing the available space. This was not considered strange or intimate or inappropriate. It was simply how things were done when accommodation was scarce. The great coaching inns on the major roads out of London, the old routes to Bath and Oxford and York, The roads that carried the mail coaches rumbling through the night had bedrooms that held 4 or 6 beds, and each bed might hold 2 or 3 travelers. Men slept next to men they had met on the road that day. They exchanged pleasantries, they shared the available heat, they pulled the rough wool blankets up to their ears, and in the morning they were strangers again. This communal sleeping was not particular to the poor or to travelers. It was a feature of institutional life generally. In the new charity schools and workhouses that the Enlightenment was busily building in an effort to organize and improve the lives of the poor, children slept in large dormitory rooms, many to bed. The naval ships that carried Britain's sea power around the world, and we will spend more time aboard those ships later, had sleeping arrangements of extraordinary closeness and density. The sailors slung their hammocks in the lower decks in rows so tight that each man had barely 18 inches of space on either side, 14 inches in some configurations. You slept with your neighbor's elbow in your face and his snoring in your ear, and you slept like this for months at a time. The rain outside has softened to a whisper. The clock ticks on. The fire settles. There is one more kind of sleeping space we should visit before we leave this chapter. It is perhaps the most interesting of all, because it sits at the intersection of the public and private in a way that is very Enlightenment, very 18th century in its particular quality. The coffee house. The coffee houses of 18th century London and Paris were not simply places to drink coffee, though coffee was indeed drunk there in great quantities, and this was itself a relatively new development in Europe, coffee having arrived from the Ottoman world only in the previous century. The coffee houses were places of news and argument and sociability and commerce. They were where you went to read the latest pamphlets, to meet acquaintances, to hear gossip, to conduct business, to be part of the humming, constantly moving conversation of the city. And sometimes in the later hours of the evening, when the conversation had quieted and the fire had burned lower and the coffee had given way to something stronger, men fell asleep in the coffee house chairs. This was tolerated. Sometimes it was expected. The better establishments might keep a blanket for the purpose. The sleeper would be left alone, his coat perhaps arranged more comfortably around him, his wig straightened, his hat set on the table beside him, and the evening would continue around him, quieter now, the talk dropping to murmurs and then to silence. There is something rather beautiful about this image, I think. The man asleep in the coffee house chair, surrounded by the last embers of the evening's conversation, the smell of coffee and tobacco and tallow candles, the sounds of the city slowly dimming outside. He has slipped out of the great conversation of the age just for a few hours. The Enlightenment is going on without him, and it will still be there in the morning. He is, for now, simply a man asleep in a chair, which is perhaps the most honest thing any of us can be. The hours of the night, ambient, deep quiet, distant owl, the faintest creak of a settling house, slow breathing, and as the night deepens, let us talk about time. Specifically, let us talk about how people in the 18th century divided the night, because the hours between sunset and sunrise did not fall for them the way they fall for us. The night was not an undifferentiated block of unconsciousness, interrupted only by the alarm clock's announcement of morning. The night had its own geography, its own texture, its own social and biological rhythms. And the most striking thing about this, for anyone used to the modern relationship with sleep, is this: many people in the 18th century did not sleep in one continuous stretch. They slept in two. The historian A. Roger Eckerch, in his remarkable scholarly work on the history of sleep, documented this practice extensively from historical sources. He called it segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. And the evidence that it was extremely common in pre-industrial Europe, running from the medieval period well into the 18th and early 19th century, is almost overwhelming once you start looking for it. The pattern worked like this. You went to bed not long after dark in winter, that might be 7 or 8 in the evening. You slept for 3 or 4 hours, and then you woke. This first waking, around midnight, was not alarming. It was not insomnia. It was expected. It was, in the language of the time, simply the waking between the first sleep and the second sleep. The first sleep and the second sleep were standard terms, used without explanation in letters and diaries and medical texts because everyone knew what they meant. They described a reality so familiar it needed no elaboration. What did people do during this hour of waking? Many things, depending on their circumstances. They prayed. The midnight office, the ancient monastic tradition of rising to pray in the middle of the night, had roots in the same biological rhythm. The monks who built the great monasteries of medieval Europe were not torturing themselves by rising at midnight for matins. They were rising at the hour when many people were naturally awake and consecrating that wakefulness to prayer. In the 18th century, many private individuals still used this interlude for quiet devotion, lying in the dark, or rising to kneel briefly, saying prayers that were different in character from the prayers of the waking day, more intimate, more uncertain. Prayers that came from a self that was not quite fully assembled yet, still halfway between sleep and consciousness. They also talked. Couples sharing a bed might use this hour of mutual wakefulness for conversation of a kind that was harder to have in the busy hours of day. The darkness and the quiet created a different kind of intimacy. Things were said in the middle of the night that were not said in daylight. They ate and drank sometimes. A piece of bread, a cup of ale, something small and sustaining. The body, having fasted since the evening meal, was sometimes hungry in this midnight hour, and the hunger was satisfied quietly, without ceremony. They read, by candlelight if they were among those who had candles to spare. The reading of this hour tended to be slower, more meditative, less purposeful than daytime reading. The light was poor, the mind was not fully awake. You read in a different way in the middle of the night, less retaining, more absorbing. Words moved through you differently. And they lay in the dark and thought. The owl calls once, distantly. Silence settles back. The thinking of the midnight interlude was, according to many accounts, a particular kind of thinking, not the systematic, forward-moving thought of the working day, not planning or problem-solving or rational argument, something looser, something that moved by association rather than logic. Something that allowed one idea to drift into another, one memory to dissolve into the next, without insisting on connection or consequence. This was thinking that was very close to dreaming. The boundary between the two, in this midnight hour, was genuinely porous. You might begin with a clear thought, a concern about a debt, a memory of something someone had said that afternoon, and slide almost imperceptibly from that into something that was no longer quite thought, no longer quite dream, but something in between, a waking reverie, a borderland state. The Enlightenment philosophers were very interested in this state, actually. The philosophers of empiricism, Locke, Hume, Condillac, spent a great deal of time thinking about the relationship between sensation, memory, and imagination. And the midnight hour, this naturally occurring liminal state, was in some ways a living laboratory for the questions they were asking. What was the difference between perception and imagination, between memory and fantasy, between the working of a fully rational mind and the free associating of a mind half given to sleep? John Locke, writing at the very beginning of our period, had suggested that the self was constituted by memory, that what made you across time was the continuity of your remembered experience. Sleep was, in this framework, slightly troubling. You could not remember your sleep. You could not, strictly speaking, be sure you were the same person who had lain down the night before. This sounds like a philosophical game, and in some ways it is. But it was also a question that had a particular texture in the midnight waking, lying in the dark between first and second sleep, feeling the strange continuity and discontinuity of being a self in time. Not quite the person you were in the afternoon, not yet the person you would be in the morning, something in between. The second sleep began sometime after this midnight waking, and it lasted until dawn, or, for the wealthy who could afford to sleep late, considerably after. It was, by many accounts, different in quality from the first, lighter, more dream-rich, more restless. The body had done its deepest restoring in the first sleep. The second was something else, less about restoration, perhaps, and more about the processing of the day, the slow metabolizing of experience into whatever dreams chose to make of it. The hour of waking, the true morning waking, the one that ended the night, was treated with considerable variation depending on who you were and what your life required. For the laboring poor, waking was determined by light, by season, by the demands of animals and fields and workshops. In summer, you rose at 4 or 5 or even earlier, because the day's work had to be done before the heat became punishing. In winter, you rose later, not as an indulgence but as common sense, because working in the dark accomplished little except wasted candles. For servants, waking was determined by the household's needs. The kitchen fire needed to be lit before the household stirred. The water needed to be heated. The fires in the upstairs rooms needed to be laid and lit. All of this happened in the cold gray dark before the master or mistress ever opened their eyes, accomplished by hands you never saw, by people who had already been awake for an hour before you began your day. For scholars and philosophers, and there were many such in the Enlightenment, the question of when to wake was a source of genuine anxiety and debate. Many of them knew from the medical literature that sleeping too long was held to be bad for health. The body that lay too long in bed grew sluggish and slow. The mind that indulged in excessive sleep became dull and torpid. The virtuous, healthy man was the one who rose early, refreshed but not over-rested, ready for the rational exertions of the day. This advice was not always followed. Voltaire, one of the great minds of the French Enlightenment, was notorious for his irregular hours, working deep into the night, rising late, conducting much of his correspondence from bed, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, and the enthusiastic disorder of a man who could not quite bring himself to leave the horizontal position long enough to be properly dressed before noon. Samuel Johnson, the great English lexicographer, had similar tendencies. He was a late riser by temperament, a night owl by nature, and his friends knew not to call on him before midday unless they were willing to speak to him in his dressing gown. The gap between what the Enlightenment prescribed and what its practitioners actually did was, in the matter of sleep as in so many others, quite wide. The fire in the ambient has burned lower. The sound is more ember than flame. The the wind outside the window has softened. There is one more aspect of 18th century nighttime worth considering, and it is the most fundamentally different from modern experience. The darkness, true darkness, the kind that no longer exists for most of us, anywhere we might be sleeping tonight. In the cities, there were street lamps of a kind, oil lamps on poles, required by law in London from the mid-17th century onward, and installed in many continental cities through the 18th. But these were dim, widely spaced, and regularly extinguished by wind or rain or simple neglect. The streets between them were dark in a way that modern people find genuinely difficult to imagine, not the darkness of a power cut, where ambient light from distant cities still colors the sky. Actual, complete, comprehensive darkness. And inside the houses, once the candles were out, the darkness was the same. You could lie in your bed with your eyes open and see nothing. Absolute nothing. Not the outline of the window, not the shape of your hand in front of your face. Nothing. This darkness was not frightening to people who had grown up with it. It was simply the condition of the night. But it was also, in its completeness, something that changed the nature of wakefulness. When you lay awake in this darkness, you were genuinely in a different world from the waking, seeing world. Your other senses became stronger, the sounds of the house settling, the breathing of the person next to you, the distant sounds of the street, the movements of animals, the changes in wind direction that you could hear and feel but not see. The midnight waking in this darkness had a quality that the midnight waking in a light-polluted, digitally illuminated modern bedroom simply cannot replicate. You were genuinely between worlds. The darkness was complete. The silence was nearly complete. You were a mind floating in a warm dark, and the rational categories of daytime, the objects and people and purposes that organized the waking world, were gone. This is perhaps why the midnight hour produced such particular thinking, such unusual dreams and visions and half-waking reveries. It was not just biology, it was the darkness, the absolute, enveloping, pre-modern dark. What they ate, what they drank, and how it shaped the night, ambient. The sound of a kitchen, distant and muffled, the settling of a pot, the last stirrings of a fire that has been banked for the night. The night does not begin with lying down. It begins earlier than that, with the evening meal, with what was drunk afterward, with the habits and customs and beliefs that surrounded the transition from day to rest. And in the 18th century, these habits were very different from our own. Let us go into the kitchen, not the grand kitchen of a great house, though we will pass through one eventually, but an ordinary kitchen. A middling household's kitchen in an English town, sometime in the middle decades of the 18th century. It is late afternoon, moving toward evening. The fire is high because the cooking is nearly done, and the smell that fills the room is something like roasting meat and bread and the faint sweetness of a pudding that has been steaming for several hours. Evening meal, supper, in an ordinary household of this period was the lightest meal of the day. The main meal, dinner, was eaten in the early or middle afternoon, and it was a substantial affair, several courses, roasted and boiled meats, vegetables, pies, puddings, bread, all of it washed down with ale or wine or cider depending on the region and the means of the household. By supper in the early evening, the appetite was usually fairly modest, a bit of bread and cheese, some cold meat left from dinner. Perhaps a bowl of something warm, a soup or a posset, which was a warm drink made from milk curdled with ale or wine and sweetened with sugar and spiced with nutmeg or mace. The posset was not just food, it was medicine. It was preparation for sleep. It was the 18th century equivalent of the warm glass of milk that well-meaning parents and physicians have been recommending in various forms across the centuries. The posset mattered because the 18th century took very seriously the idea that what you ate and drank in the hours before bed would directly shape the quality of your sleep. The medical literature was full of advice on this score, and much of it was surprisingly consistent with what we know now, though the reasoning behind it was rather different. Heavy, fatty, meaty food eaten too close to bedtime would, the physicians warned, produce troubled sleep. The digestive system would be working too hard, sending too much blood and animal spirits to the stomach, leaving the brain insufficiently supplied. You would sleep restlessly, turning and waking, oppressed by a heaviness that was not rest but indigestion dressed up as rest. Alcohol was a more complex matter. Wine and ale were ubiquitous in this period, drunk at almost every meal, by almost every class, partly because the water in most cities was genuinely dangerous, and partly because mild intoxication was simply a background condition of daily 18th century life. The question for sleep was not whether to drink, but how much and when. Small quantities of wine were thought to promote sleep. A cup of wine after supper relaxed the nerves, quieted the animal's spirits, prepared the body for its nightly retreat. This was uncontroversial medical opinion, and it was widely practiced. The posset itself was alcoholic. Warm ale sweetened with sugar was another common bedtime preparation, but large quantities of alcohol, the kind consumed in the taverns and gentlemen's clubs that the century was full of, were understood to produce a different kind of sleep entirely. A heavy, stuporous sleep, deeper than natural but less restorative. You would sleep soundly enough, you would sleep through a cannon shot, as the saying went, but you would wake feeling worse than when you lay down. Your head would ache, your mouth would be dry. The pleasant numbness of the night before would have curdled into something less pleasant by morning. This was not moralizing in the modern sense. It was practical medicine. The physicians were not condemning drinking. They were simply noting its effects on sleep quality as carefully as they could with the tools available to them. A distant sound, the rhythmic clinking of cups being set out on a table, then fading into silence. Coffee and tea introduced an entirely new complexity into the evening habits of the 18th century. Coffee had arrived in Europe from the Ottoman world in the 17th century, and by the early 1700s, it was absolutely everywhere, drunk in the coffee houses that lined the streets of every major European city, drunk at home by those who could afford it, an unavoidable feature of the social landscape of the age. Tea arrived in England somewhat later and through different channels, through the East India Company's trade with China, but it spread with extraordinary speed through the middle and upper classes. By the middle of the 18th century, the tea-drinking habits of the English were already attracting comment from foreign visitors, who found the enthusiasm slightly excessive. Both substances, the 18th century gradually realized, kept you awake. This seems obvious to us. But it was not immediately obvious to people encountering them for the first time, and the medical establishment spent considerable energy trying to work out whether this wakefulness was beneficial or harmful. The early enthusiasm was considerable. Coffee, some physicians argued, was a boon to intellectual productivity. It sharpened the mind, cleared the vapors, allowed the scholar to work longer into the night. It was the fuel of the Enlightenment in a very literal sense. The coffee houses where the age's greatest conversations happened would not have been possible without the drink that sustained them. But gradually, concerns began to emerge. Physicians started noting that habitual coffee drinkers had more difficulty sleeping, that they were more prone to what the century called nervous complaints, anxiety, agitation, a tendency to be easily startled, that the sharpening of the mind that coffee produced came at a cost, paid in the coin of broken nights and restless waking. The debate about coffee and sleep was not resolved in the 18th century. It is barely resolved now, but it illustrates something important about the period. Even as it embraced novelty and progressed with enormous enthusiasm, the Enlightenment was not entirely naive about the trade-offs involved. New pleasures brought new problems. New substances had consequences that took time to understand. The habit that emerged in many households was a compromise that will sound familiar. Coffee was for the morning and perhaps the early afternoon. Tea, with its somewhat lower stimulant content, was for the late afternoon and early evening. And in the hours immediately before bed, you returned to the older beverages, the warm posset, the small cup of wine, the cup of warm milk if you were inclined to simplicity. This was not universal. Many people ignored the medical advice entirely and drank coffee when they pleased and slept badly as a consequence. This is also very familiar. There is another substance that shaped the nights of the Enlightenment, and it is one that does not fit easily into any of our modern categories. Laudanum. Laudanum was a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol, typically in wine or brandy, and it was, in the 18th century, an entirely legal and widely available medicine. It was sold in apothecaries without any particular restriction. It was prescribed by physicians for a vast range of complaints: pain, anxiety, coughs, stomach troubles, nervous disorders, melancholy. And it was predictably also used for sleep. The effects of laudanum on sleep were dramatic and immediate. A moderate dose produced a deep, heavy, rapid unconsciousness that was quite unlike natural sleep, less restorative perhaps, but profoundly effective at silencing the restless, anxious, overstimulated mind of the educated 18th century person. Laudanum use was extremely common in this period. Women, particularly, were frequently prescribed it for what the century called nervous disorders, a catch-all diagnosis that covered everything from genuine anxiety and depression to the simple stress of living in a world that was changing very fast. Men used it too, though they were perhaps less likely to describe themselves as ill when they did so. Many of the great figures of the age used laudanum at various points in their lives. Erasmus Darwin, Samuel Johnson's contemporary, the poet William Cowper, the novelist Tobias Smollett. The 18th century understood in a general way that laudanum could become habit-forming. There is evidence in the medical literature of patients who found they could no longer sleep without it, who needed larger and larger doses to achieve the same effect, who became, in the language of the time, enslaved to the drug. But the moral framework around this dependence was different from ours. It was a medical problem, not a moral failing. You had developed an unfortunate bodily habit, and the question was how to correct it. Gradual withdrawal, the physicians generally recommended, replacement of laudanum with smaller doses of milder preparations, the eventual goal of sleeping without any assistance at all. This advice was more easily given than followed, as it always has been in every century. Ambient has grown very quiet. just the faintest ember glow of sound and the slow, steady tick of a clock. Let us return to the evening for a moment and sit with it. The evening meal has been eaten. The fire is still going in the parlor or the study. It will be allowed to burn down on its own rather than extinguished, since relighting it in the morning is easier when the coals are still warm. The candles are still lit, though fewer than before, because candles are expensive and you use only what you need. The household is settling. The sounds of activity that filled the afternoon, voices, footsteps, the movement of furniture, the clatter of the kitchen are growing quieter. The children, if there are children, have been put to bed. The servants are finishing their tasks and making their way toward the attic stairs. The master of the house or the mistress, or both together, are moving through the last rituals of the day, reading, perhaps. Correspondence, perhaps. The 18th century was a great age of letter writing, and a quiet evening hour was often devoted to it. Or simply sitting together by the fire, talking about the day just passed in a domestic, unhurried way that made no great demands on the mind. And then the candles begin to go out, one by one. The transformation of the candlelit room into darkness was one of the small rituals of the evening, and it was performed with a particular instrument, the snuffer. Not to blow out candles, that was considered bad form, scattering hot wax and creating an unpleasant smell, but to snuff them cleanly, the little cone of the snuffer placed over the flame and pressed down to suffocate it without drama. Each small extinction made the room a little dimmer, a little more private. The shadows deepened. The sounds of the house asserted themselves more clearly: the fire, the wind, the creak of timbers, the distant sound of the street. And when the last candle was out, the darkness was complete. This moment, the moment of the last light, had a weight to it. A psychological weight as well as a practical one. You were crossing from day into night, from the world of seeing and doing into the world of rest and darkness. It was a transition that happened every day, that was ordinary and expected, but that was also, in its quiet way, significant. The person who blew out the last candle, or snuffed it rather, was not just going to bed. They were ending a day, releasing it, letting it be what it had been, for better or worse, and surrendering the self to the darkness that renewed all things. Dreams in the rational mind, ambient, very soft, with a slight otherworldly quality, the sound of wind, distant and slow, and beneath it the faintest suggestion of running water. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, there were dreams. There have always been dreams. Every human culture that has ever existed has had to account for them, to place them in some framework of meaning, to decide what they were and where they came from and what, if anything, they signified. The 18th century inherited a long and complicated tradition on this score. For most of human history, dreams had been understood as communications, from gods, from the dead, from supernatural forces of various kinds. The dream was a visitation. Something was being shown to you, something was being said. The dream interpreter, the priest, the shaman, the wise woman, the biblical Joseph in his multicolored coat, was the person who could decipher these communications and translate them into useful guidance for the waking world. The Enlightenment was deeply uncomfortable with this tradition, not because the Enlightenment did not dream. Everyone dreamed. The philosophers and scientists of the age dreamed as richly and vividly as anyone else, perhaps more so, given that many of them had intense, overworked, stimulant-fueled mental lives that generated vivid and complex dream content. But the idea that dreams were divine communications, that they carried messages from outside the self, was precisely the kind of superstition that the Age of Reason was committed to dismantling. So the Enlightenment had to find another way to think about dreams. A rational way, a way that preserved the phenomena, the strange, vivid, emotional experiences of dreaming, while offering an explanation that did not require supernatural agents. This turned out to be surprisingly difficult. The most influential rational explanation for dreams in the 18th century was essentially physiological. Dreams were the byproducts of bodily processes. When the nervous system was not fully at rest, when some organ was disturbed, or some external stimulus was impinging on the sleeper, or the blood was moving in an unusual way through the brain, the mind, even in sleep, produced images and narratives in response. This was why, the physicians argued, eating a heavy meal produced vivid and often disturbing dreams. The digestive system was working hard, generating heat and activity in the abdomen, and this activity was translated, through the nerves, into the imagery of the dream. Similarly, sleeping in a cold room might produce dreams of being lost outdoors in winter. A blanket that had slipped and exposed the sleeper's feet to cold air might produce dreams of being drowned or buried. An arm fallen asleep, compressed by the weight of the body, blood flow restricted, might produce dreams of paralysis, of being pinned down, of the terrible heaviness that could not be lifted. This physiological theory of dreams had the great advantage of being testable, at least in principle, and it explained a lot. The connections between bodily state and dream content are real. We know this now from sleep science, and the 18th century was not wrong to notice them. If you fall asleep with a full stomach, you are more likely to have vivid and unsettling dreams. If you are cold, your dreams may reflect it. These are genuine observations, but the theory did not explain everything. It did not explain the emotional resonance of dreams, the way that a dream could leave you feeling devastated or exhilarated in a way that no cold foot or heavy dinner could account for. It did not explain the narrative coherence of some dreams, the way they could unfold with the internal logic of a story that seemed, in the dreaming, entirely real. It did not explain the way that dreams sometimes seem to process things that the dreamer was genuinely troubled about: conflicts, fears, losses, desires, things that were psychologically real, not physiologically random. The Enlightenment noticed all of this, and it made the thinkers of the age uncomfortable, because it pointed toward an interior life that was larger and stranger than the rational framework wanted to accommodate. The wind in the ambient deepens slightly, then softens again. There were several figures in the 18th century who grappled with dreams with particular seriousness, and it is worth pausing with a few of them. The philosopher Christian Wolff, a German thinker of the early 18th century, wrote about dreams in a way that was characteristic of the rationalist tradition. Dreams, he argued, were the product of the soul's continuing activity during sleep. The soul did not cease to function when the body rested. It continued to perceive and to think, but in a different mode, freed from the constraints of sensory input, drawing instead on memory and imagination, producing representations that were less disciplined, less controlled than the careful perceptions of waking thought. This was a more sympathetic account of dreaming than the purely physiological one. It gave the dream a kind of dignity. It was not just the symptom of a disturbed stomach, but the product of a soul still working, still reaching toward understanding, even in the dark. But Wolff was careful to maintain the hierarchy. Waking rational thought was still superior. The dream was a lesser mode, a degraded form of cognition, valuable perhaps for what it revealed about the contents of the mind, but not to be trusted as a guide to truth or action. David Hume, the great Scottish empiricist, took a somewhat different approach. Hume was fascinated by the relationship between memory, imagination, and belief, and he saw dreams as illuminating precisely the lines between these faculties. When we dream, he observed, we believe what we are experiencing is real. We feel emotions that are as genuine and as intense as any waking emotion. The dream tragedy grieves us as sincerely as a real loss. The dream terror frightens us as completely as a real danger. This was philosophically interesting because it raised the question, what is belief? If the dreaming mind can produce belief without evidence, without rational evaluation, then what is the status of waking belief? How certain are we that our waking experiences are as reliable as we take them to be? Hume did not push this toward skepticism about reality in any devastating way. He was too careful a thinker for that. But he let the question stand, and it was a question that the century found both fascinating and slightly vertiginous. The dreams that people actually described in their letters and diaries, the raw material of 18th century dream experience, rather than the philosophers' theories about it, were a vivid collection of human concerns. They dreamed about the dead. This was almost universal. You dreamed about people who had died, parents, spouses, children, friends, and in the dream they were alive again, restored, and you spoke with them and felt all the fullness of the relationship and then woke to the grief of knowing they were gone. These dreams were painful and also sometimes consoling. The person was gone, and yet here they were, as real as they had ever been, speaking to you in their particular voice with their particular expressions. The Enlightenment, committed to rationalism, generally discouraged the interpretation of these dreams as genuine communications from the dead. The soul of the departed was not visiting you. Your own memory, your own longing was producing the image. The dead were the dead, but many people found this cold comfort, and in the privacy of their diaries and their letters, they allowed themselves to hope that the dream visitor had been more than just memory. They dreamed about failure. The examination dream, the performance dream, the dream of being unprepared, of arriving somewhere important without the necessary equipment, of being exposed as inadequate, these were as common in the 18th century as they are now. The scholar who dreamed he could not remember the Latin he needed. The merchant who dreamed his ships had all sunk. The courtier who dreamed he had arrived at court with his coat wrongly buttoned and the king staring. They dreamed about desire. These were the dreams that the Enlightenment was most careful and most evasive about, because they pointed towards something the rational framework found particularly difficult: the existence of powerful, uncontrollable desires that did not follow the rules of reason. The dreams of the body were not polite about social hierarchy or marital fidelity or religious propriety. They followed their own rules, and those rules were embarrassing to the rational, self-controlled self. Medical literature handled these dreams carefully, acknowledging their existence, cautioning against the physical overstimulation that was thought to produce them: spicy food, strong drink, thinking too hard about certain subjects before bed, and generally recommending a life of moderate, well-regulated behavior as the best prophylactic against immodest dreams. This advice was also more easily given than followed. The ambient sound is very still now. just the faintest breathing of wind. A settling, a deepening. There was one category of dream that the 18th century found particularly distressing, and which it tried very hard to explain in rational terms and never quite managed: the nightmare. Not the word as we now use it, a general term for any bad dream. The original nightmare was something more specific and more frightening. It was the experience of waking, or seeming to wake in the middle of the night, in the grip of a paralyzing terror. You were conscious or seemed to be conscious, but you could not move, you could not speak, you could not cry out, and pressing down on your chest was a presence, a weight, something that had no clear form but was absolutely, undeniably there. This experience was attributed in the folk tradition to a creature called the mare, a supernatural being, typically female, who sat on the chest of the sleeper and pressed the breath out of them. The word nightmare comes from this creature. The German Nachtmar, the Danish mare, the Old English mare, all variants of the same ancient figure, found across Northern European folklore with remarkable consistency. The Enlightenment, of course, did not believe in the mare. The mare was superstition, was folk belief, was exactly the kind of pre-rational explanation that educated people were supposed to have moved beyond. So what was it? We know now, with the benefit of sleep science, that what people were experiencing was sleep paralysis, a phenomenon that occurs when the brain wakes partially, while the body remains in the paralytic state that prevents you from acting out your dreams. It is terrifying, it is real, and it is extremely common. The hallucinated presence on the chest, the incubus, the mare, the old hag in her various cultural forms, is one of the most consistent and universal experiences of sleep paralysis, reported across cultures and centuries with striking similarity. The 18th century did not have this explanation. Its physicians produced various alternatives: an accumulation of blood in the brain, indigestion, sleeping in the wrong position, the suppression of some vital excretion. None of these was satisfactory. None of them adequately accounted for the specific, overwhelming quality of the experience, the paralysis, the presence, the absolute terror that was, somehow, not quite terror and not quite anything else, but something you could not name. This was one of the places where the Enlightenment's confident explanatory project quietly ran out of answers. The nightmare remained. Unexplained, unreasonable, returning uninvited to the most rational of minds on the most ordinary of nights, which is perhaps its own kind of education. The philosopher's bedroom, ambient, a quieter, more studious sound, the distant scratch of a quill, the soft turn of pages, the occasional pop of a candle flame, and as the night deepens, let us visit a philosopher. Not a generic philosopher, an idea of one, but a specific room, a specific life, a specific relationship between the life of the mind and the life of the body at rest. Let us visit Immanuel Kant in Königsberg. Kant is one of the towering figures of the Enlightenment, the German philosopher whose Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, transformed the intellectual landscape of Europe, and whose work continues to be read and argued over 3 centuries later. He is also, for our purposes, fascinating for a more intimate reason. He was a man of extraordinarily regular habits, and those habits included a very particular, very deliberate approach to sleep. Kant lived in Königsberg, in what is now Russia, for virtually his entire life. He is famous for never having traveled more than about 40 miles from the city where he was born. And within that city, he lived according to a schedule of such precision that the story, almost certainly apocryphal, but too perfect not to repeat, is that the citizens of Königsberg set their clocks by his daily walk. He rose at 5 o'clock in the morning, not 4:30, not 5:15, 5. He had given instructions to his servant, a man named Lamp, that he was to be woken at 5 without fail, and that if he showed signs of wanting to remain in bed, Lamp was to insist. Kant understood his own weakness for the warm horizontal position. He had written about the temptation of lying in bed in the morning, the way the comfortable body argues against the obligations of the will, the way the mind generates excellent reasons for staying exactly where it is. He was not immune to this temptation. He simply refused to give in to it. He worked in the morning, lectured at the university in the late morning, ate dinner at midday, his main meal, often with guests. Kant was a sociable man despite his reputation for abstraction, and he considered good conversation at the dinner table one of the genuine pleasures of life. He walked in the afternoon, the famous walk, alone in the same direction at the same pace for the same duration almost every day, and he went to bed at 10 o'clock in the evening. Again, not 9:30, not 10:15, 10, 7 hours of sleep, precisely calculated. He believed, and the physicians of his age would have agreed, that 7 hours was the optimal quantity for a man of his constitution and his intellectual demands. He woke feeling, when Lamp had insisted, and he had submitted, refreshed and ready. He had learned over decades what his body needed, and he gave it that and not more. The distant quill is still. The room is very quiet. Kant's approach to sleep reflects something important about the Enlightenment's ideal of the rational man managing his own body. The body was a machine in the mechanistic philosophy of the age, and like any machine, it required maintenance. Proper sleep was maintenance. The rational man understood his body's requirements and met them, not indulging in excess, not depriving himself through overwork, but finding the precise calibration that allowed the machine to operate at its best. This was the ideal. Most people did not live up to it. Voltaire, as we have mentioned, was famously irregular. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose philosophy celebrated the natural and the spontaneous over the artificial and the constructed, had correspondingly chaotic sleep habits. He was prone to long, wakeful nights and late mornings, and he spent considerable time in his autobiographical writings worrying about his health, his nerves, his digestion, and all the other physical complaints that seemed to afflict him in alternating waves. Samuel Johnson, across the Channel in London, was a figure of almost epic nocturnal restlessness. He was deeply afraid of sleep, or rather, of what came with sleep. He was afraid of death, and sleep seemed to him a kind of small death, a daily rehearsal for the final unconsciousness. He stayed awake as long as he could, talking in the coffee houses and taverns and drawing rooms of London until his companions had all gone home, and then he walked the streets alone in the small hours, and then he finally went home and tried to sleep in a room he kept deliberately disordered, as if the disorder might somehow argue against the terrible neatness of death. He did not sleep well. He recorded this in his diaries with a kind of mournful precision, noting the hours of waking, the difficulty of returning to sleep, the state in which he found himself in the morning. He knew that his habits were not rational, that a man of his constitution and age should be sleeping more regularly and more soundly. He could not help it. The fear was stronger than the reason. There is a letter, one of hundreds actually, though this particular one is less well known than many, written by Denis Diderot, the French philosopher and co-editor of the great encyclopedia, to his mistress Sophie Volland, in which he describes a sleepless night in considerable detail. It is a summer night in Paris. The city outside his window is not quiet. Paris was never quiet, even at midnight in the 18th century. There are the sounds of the river, the distant calling of street vendors who work through the night, the occasional clatter of a carriage over the cobblestones. And in the room there is the heat, the particular heavy heat of a Paris summer night, which has not moved in a week and which sits on the chest like a physical weight. Diderot cannot sleep. He has tried lying on his left side, then his right side, then his back, then his stomach. He has kicked off the blankets and then pulled them back when the night air cooled. He has drunk water, he has read, but the candle makes the room hotter, and his eyes, he says, are tired enough that the letters swim. And so he lies there in the dark and he thinks. He thinks about Sophie, this goes without saying, given that he is writing to her. But he also thinks about ideas. He thinks about a problem in natural philosophy that has been occupying him for weeks. He thinks about a conversation he had that afternoon with a neighbor who had said something interesting and wrong about the nature of the passions. He thinks about his daughter and whether she is well, and whether he is a good father, and whether anyone can answer that question from the inside. The night goes on. The city outside maintains its murmur. The heat does not relent. Around 3 a.m, he writes, he fell into a half-sleep, not quite waking, in which the ideas that had been moving through his mind began to move differently, more freely, less controlled, one thought dissolving into another without explanation. The neighbor's wrong statement about the passions becoming, somehow, a landscape, a field he was walking through, and then the field becoming something else, and then he was no longer thinking about anything at all. He woke at 5. The city was already beginning its daily noise. He felt, he wrote, not rested exactly, but quieter, as if the night had worked on him in its own way, doing whatever it was that nights did, whether you slept or not. This letter, ordinary, intimate, written to be read by one person who would understand its context, captures something that the philosophical treatises miss. The night is not an abstract question about the nature of sleep and consciousness. It is a summer night in Paris, and you are hot, and your mind will not stop, and eventually something shifts and you are a little better than you were. That is the Enlightenment sleep, not the ideal of 7 hours at 10 o'clock, measured and calibrated by the rational will, but a warm night and a restless mind, and the slow, unhurried work of darkness doing what darkness has always done. Women in sleep in the 18th century, ambient, a gentler sound, the rustling of silk, a smaller fire, the particular quiet of a room that is more softly furnished. The history of sleep in the Enlightenment is also necessarily a history of gender. Because the way people slept, when, where, how, and with what anxieties was shaped in important ways by whether they were men or women, by what was expected of them, by how their bodies were understood, and by the particular pressures of the world they inhabited. Let us spend some time in the women's world of this period. Not the idealized, romanticized version that appears in portraits and novels, but the actual world, complicated, constrained, and yet full of its own forms of ingenuity and resistance. The 18th century had a particular theory about women and sleep. inherited from earlier medicine and still very much alive in this period. Women, the medical literature held, were more susceptible to nervous disorders than men. Their nervous systems were more delicate, more easily disturbed, more responsive to slight disturbances that a man's more robust constitution might weather without difficulty. This was not a kind assessment, despite being presented as one. It was used to justify a great deal of restriction and condescension. Women who experienced insomnia, or who were distressed, or who complained of headaches or fatigue or low spirits, were told that this was natural, the inevitable consequence of their delicate constitution, and that the remedy was rest, quiet, and the avoidance of stimulation. The stimulation to be avoided was, in particular, intellectual stimulation. Too much reading, too much thinking, too much of the kind of intense mental activity that men engaged in as a matter of course, was held to be bad for women's health. It overstimulated their more sensitive nerves. It produced exactly the kind of restless, overactive mental state that led to sleeplessness and nervous complaints. This was, of course, convenient doctrine for a society that preferred women not to engage too actively with the intellectual life of the age. And it was argued against with increasing force by women who noticed that their own experience did not support it. But it was the dominant medical opinion for most of the 18th century, and it shaped how women were expected to think about their own sleep. The silk rustles again very softly, the fire settles. The reality of women's sleep in the 18th century was considerably more complex and more interesting than the medical theory suggested. In the great households, the mistress of the house had considerable control over her sleeping environment. The mistress's dressing room and bedchamber were her domain, spaces she could arrange according to her own preferences, furnished as she wished, used as she saw fit. Many aristocratic and upper-middle-class women of this period used their bedchambers as spaces of considerable independence. They received morning visitors there. The lever was not exclusively a royal practice. Friends, correspondents, even in some cases professional advisors, might be received by a woman still in her bed or at her dressing table, in a setting that was simultaneously intimate and commanding. The bed in these circumstances was a throne of sorts. The woman in her bed, surrounded by her pillows and her bed curtains and her morning correspondence, was in a position of informality that was also a position of authority. She was in her own space, on her own terms. The world was coming to her. This was a form of power available primarily to women of considerable means. For women of the middling sort, the wives of merchants and craftsmen and clergymen, the bedroom was less of a social space and more genuinely a place of rest. Or at least, that was the theory. In practice, the bedroom of the middle-class woman was also often the room where she nursed sick children, where she recovered from childbirth, where she conducted the kinds of practical conversations that needed to happen away from the servants. For poor women, sleep was largely a matter of survival. The women who worked in the markets and the laundries and the great houses as servants slept when and where they could, often in conditions of considerable discomfort, waking early and working late, and sleeping the deep, exhausted sleep of bodies that had been pushed to their limits. Childbirth and its aftermath deserve their own moment in this story of women and sleep. Childbirth in the 18th century was a long, exhausting, dangerous, and almost entirely female process. It happened at home. It was attended by a midwife, a woman with practical experience in the management of labor and delivery, and by female friends and neighbors, but rarely by the husband and rarely by a physician, except in cases of genuine emergency. The period immediately following birth, the lying in, was a socially recognized state of rest and recuperation that lasted, ideally, for several weeks. The new mother was kept in bed, warm, fed strengthening broths and possets, visited by female friends who came to admire the baby and offer advice, and generally treated as someone who needed careful tending. The lying in was one of the few periods in an 18th century woman's life when rest was not just permitted, but actively prescribed by social custom and medical opinion. You were supposed to lie in bed. You were supposed to sleep when you could. You were supposed to be warm and quiet and looked after. In the great houses, this period could be quite comfortable. The lying-in chamber was specially prepared, hung with warm curtains, heated to a temperature that modern people would probably find excessive, filled with the particular quiet of a room that has been deliberately arranged to exclude the noise of the world. In poorer households, the reality was rather different. A woman who had no servants, no income to pay for a monthly nurse, no female relatives nearby to help, could not afford weeks of rest. She might be back on her feet within days, necessity overriding prescription, doing the work that could not wait for anyone. And the baby, of course, meant broken sleep for months, potentially years, if you had several children in close succession, as most women did. The interrupted nights of early parenthood are not a modern phenomenon. They are the oldest feature of the parental experience, as universal as anything in human life. A baby cries very distantly in the ambient, just once, then silence. The fire continues. There is something I want to say here gently that the historical record tends to understate. Women in the 18th century thought about sleep with great seriousness and sophistication. They wrote about it in their diaries and letters, about what disturbed their sleep, about what helped, about the particular anxieties that lay awake with them in the dark. These are not the writings of passive, delicate creatures undone by the excessive stimulation of their own thoughts. They are the writings of people managing complex lives with considerable intelligence and considerable frustration at the constraints they operated under. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the English writer and traveler who lived from 1689 to 1762, wrote about sleep and health, and the body with the same pragmatic intelligence she brought to everything else. She was skeptical of the medical establishment's theories about female delicacy, and she said so in her characteristic way, ride direct, with the understated contempt of a woman who has seen too much to be impressed by men who think they understand her. Hester Thrale, the English writer and diarist whose voluminous journals recorded the social and intellectual life of late 18th century England, kept careful notes on her own health and sleep across decades. She was a woman who slept badly in times of stress, who used writing itself as a form of nighttime processing, setting down her worries on paper as a way of emptying them out of her head so that she could finally rest. And Mary Wollstonecraft, the great feminist thinker whose Vindication of the Rights of Woman appeared in 1792, wrote in that work with considerable passion about the way that women's physical health, including their sleep, was damaged by the conditions of their lives. The enforced idleness, the lack of genuine intellectual engagement, the constant performance of delicacy and femininity, these were not good for the body or the mind or the sleep. Women were told they needed rest. What they needed, Wollstonecraft argued, was something much more demanding and much more real. This was a radical claim in its time. It still has something to teach us. Sleep at sea, ambient, the deep rhythmic sound of ocean waves, the creak of wooden timbers, the low groan of a ship in moderate seas, the distant sound of wind in rigging, and as the night deepens, let us go further from the shore. The 18th century was, among other things, an age of extraordinary maritime expansion. The great seafaring nations of Europe, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch Republic, were pushing their ships and their ambitions to the farthest reaches of the world. Explorers were charting coastlines that European maps had left blank. Naval officers were fighting for control of trade routes that brought wealth and power to entire empires. Merchant vessels were making the slow, grinding Atlantic crossings that linked the old world to the new, carrying goods people, and the terrible machinery of the slave trade. At sea, sleep was a fundamentally different proposition from anything we have discussed so far. In the Royal Navy of the 18th century, the men who sailed the great ships of the line, those magnificent, terrifying wooden fortresses that might carry 100 or more guns and several hundred men, slept in hammocks. The hammock was a West Indian invention, borrowed by European sailors in the 16th century and found to be perfect for shipboard sleeping. It hung from hooks in the overhead beams of the lower decks, swinging gently with the motion of the ship, and it had several virtues. It was compact. It packed away quickly when not in use, freeing the deck for the work of sailing and, when necessary, fighting. It self-leveled with the ship's motion, which meant that even in heavy weather, when the ship was rolling and pitching, the hammock's occupant swung on a horizontal plane, cradled in a sense by the very motion that would otherwise keep a man awake. For men accustomed to hammocks, this motion was soporific. The slow, rhythmic swing of the hammock, counterpointing the ship's own movement, was more lulling than any bed. Sailors spoke of sleeping in hammocks as one of the genuine pleasures of the sea life, once you were used to it, once the body had learned to release into the swing rather than resist it. Getting used to it, though, took time. New recruits, pressed men in many cases, dragged from their lives ashore by the notorious press gangs that supplied the Navy with its labor, found the first nights in a hammock genuinely miserable. The ship moved in ways their bodies had no experience of. Every surge and roll of the vessel through dark Atlantic water woke them, heart-pounding, certain they were falling. The sounds of the ship at night were extraordinary, the constant, complex music of wood and rope and water and wind, and these sounds were nothing like any sound they had heard ashore, but the body learned. Within a few weeks, most sailors had adapted to the motion, had learned to read the sounds of the ship, had developed the sailor's ability to sleep in the most unpromising circumstances, a skill that would serve them for the rest of their lives. The ship sounds in the ambient become a little more present, the creak of the hull, the sound of water against the planking below. The organization of sleep aboard a naval vessel was carefully calibrated to the needs of keeping a ship running 24 hours a day. The crew was divided into watches, typically the starboard and larboard watches, each taking a 4-hour shift on deck, alternating through the day and night. This meant that each sailor was on duty for 4 hours, then off for 4 hours, then on again, in a cycle that made continuous, uninterrupted sleep essentially impossible. The 4-hour off-watch period was not entirely sleeping time. There were meals to eat, equipment to maintain, the endless small tasks of shipboard life that fell to whoever happened to have time. Sleep was fitted in where it could be found, in the hammock if you were lucky, on deck in fair weather if the off-watch happened to coincide with a warm night and a light wind. The dog watches, 2 short 2-hour shifts between 4 and 8 in the evening, were the exceptions, designed to rotate the system so that the same men were not always on duty at the same hour. They also provided a brief common time in the late afternoon when both watches were on deck together, before the long night watch began. This fragmented, irregular sleep was the norm for ordinary sailors throughout the age of sail. It was physiologically demanding. It meant chronic sleep debt, always sleeping less than you needed, always slightly behind on the rest your body required. Sailors who came ashore after a long voyage reportedly slept for astonishing stretches, 12, 14, 16 hours, as the body made up what it had been denied. The officers slept somewhat better, in cabins below the waterline in the stern of the ship, with the faint luxury of a private space, a bunk rather than a hammock, and watch schedules that were somewhat more generous. The captain's cabin at the very stern was the most private and the most comfortable space on the ship, private access to fresh air through the stern windows, a writing desk, a bunk in an alcove, and the particular solitude of command. But even the captain slept in a moving, noisy, unpredictable environment, woken at any hour by weather or emergency or the simple demands of navigating a complex vessel through dangerous waters. The captain's sleep was never secure. That was part of what command meant. We should spend a moment with the experience of sleep in heavy weather, because it is one of the most vivid and specific things the accounts of 18th century sailors describe. When the weather turned bad, when the winds built and the sea rose, and the ship began to labor through swells that might be 30 or 40 feet from trough to crest, sleep became almost entirely impossible for anyone but the most seasoned and most exhausted. The motion of a ship in heavy weather is not the gentle rocking of a cradle. It is violent and unpredictable. The hull drives up the face of a wave and then falls away into the trough, and the motion is sometimes so sharp that unsecured objects fly across the deck. The noise is extraordinary, the shrieking of the wind in the rigging, the thunderous crash of waves against the hull, the groaning of the whole vast structure of wood and rope as it flexes and fights and holds. In these conditions, men in the lower decks lay in their hammocks and were thrown about and generally failed to sleep. The off-watchmen were needed constantly, to man the pumps if the ship was taking water, to handle emergency sail changes, to do whatever the storm demanded. Sleep was deferred, sometimes for days. And when the storm passed, when the wind eased and the sea flattened and the ship settled into calmer running, there was a collective exhalation, a sinking, a giving up of the tension that had held everyone upright and awake, and men slept in the sudden quiet with an abandon that was almost beautiful. Lying wherever they had happened to stop, still in their wet clothes, in the growing warmth of a sun that had reappeared above clearing clouds. That sleep after a storm was described by sailors as one of the finest things a life at sea could offer. The ocean sounds in the ambient settle into a steadier, calmer rhythm. The ship is in calmer water now. The creak of the timbers becomes a slow, regular music. The question of tropical sleep deserves its own attention. Many of the voyages of the 18th century took ships from the cold, gray North Atlantic into the tropics, the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific. And the tropics presented a completely different set of challenges to sleep. The heat was the first thing. Below decks on a wooden ship in the tropics, with no ventilation beyond the gun ports and the occasional hatch, the temperature could become suffocating. Sailors slept in the minimal clothing they possessed, in hammocks that collected sweat. The smell was significant. The insects were the second thing. Mosquitoes in the Caribbean and along tropical coasts were not just an annoyance. They were killers, carrying malaria and yellow fever and other fevers that devastated ships' crews without mercy. Sleeping on deck was cooler but exposed. Sleeping below was safer from insects but stifling with heat, and the nights were shorter. In the tropics, the transition from day to night is fast. There is little of the long, gradual twilight of northern latitudes. Sun drops and the dark comes quickly, and then the dark gives way equally quickly to dawn, and the day begins again with a heat that the night has not fully dissipated. The sailors and explorers who describe these tropical nights write with a mixture of wonder and exhaustion. The stars in the tropics are extraordinary. You are looking at the sky from a different angle than the one you grew up with, and the constellations are unfamiliar, and new stars appear that were below the horizon in England or France. Many sailors became amateur astronomers out of sheer necessity. You needed the stars to navigate. But they also became students of the tropical night in a more leisurely way, noting the sounds and the smells and the particular quality of the dark on a calm sea near the equator, where the water could be phosphorescent, glowing green-blue beneath the hull, and the sky could be so full of stars that you could almost read by their light. This was the sleep of the explorer, not sleep at all, much of the time, but a watchful, attentive half-wakefulness, learning the world's night from a position of uncomfortable intimacy with the elements. The academies and their scholars, ambient, the sound of a library at night, very quiet, with the distant settling of shelves, the occasional creak of a floorboard, the soft sound of books being turned, the Enlightenment-built institutions. This was one of its most characteristic activities. Academies of science and letters, philosophical societies, universities reformed and expanded, learned journals launched and sustained, collections assembled and catalogued. The institutions of the Enlightenment were machines for producing and organizing knowledge, and they were staffed by men and a very few women who dedicated their lives to the project. And these men, these dedicated scholars and scientists and philosophers, had a particular relationship with sleep that was shaped by their institutions and their work. Let us visit one of the great academies. The Royal Society of London, founded in the previous century but thriving in the 18th, met regularly to hear papers on every subject imaginable: the optics of rainbows, the breeding habits of bees, the geology of mountains, the properties of electrical charge. The men who belonged to it were the intellectual elite of England, and they took their membership seriously. They also, many of them, worked at night. The scholar's candle burning in a study window in the small hours while the rest of the household slept was both a reality and a symbol. It was the sign of a man devoted to knowledge past the ordinary hours, sacrificing sleep for the advancement of understanding. It was admired. It was also, as the physicians of the age frequently pointed out, not particularly good for you. The tension between the intellectual life and the healthy life was one that the Enlightenment never fully resolved. The ideals of the age, reason, observation, argument, the constant advancement of knowledge demanded time and energy that had to come from somewhere. Sleep was often the first sacrifice. Many of the great scholars of the 18th century were, by their own accounts, and those of people who knew them, poor sleepers. Not necessarily because they were anxious or unhappy, but because they were intellectually overexcited. The mind that has spent the day wrestling with a problem in mathematics or natural philosophy does not easily let go of it at bedtime. The problem follows you into the bedroom, sits on the edge of the mattress, continues to present itself in new configurations while you are trying to quiet yourself for sleep. The Royal Society men wrote about this in their letters with a kind of proud exhaustion, noting the late hour at which they had finally laid down their pen, the earliness of the hour at which they had risen, the number of pages written in between. They were competing, in a gentle way, with each other and with their own pasts. The scholar who had slept only 4 hours to finish his paper was in some sense more devoted, more serious, than one who had slept his full 7. This was not the most rational of attitudes, but it was the human attitude. A book falls from a shelf somewhere in the ambient, a soft, slow sound, then quiet again. The universities of the 18th century had their own relationship with sleep, shaped by the rhythms of institutional life. Oxford and Cambridge, the two English universities, had kept essentially medieval schedules well into the 1700s. Lectures began early, 6 or 7 in the morning in some cases. The day was structured by chapel services, meals, lectures, and the informal conversations of college life. And the night was, in theory, quiet and orderly, with scholars in their rooms by a prescribed hour. In practice, of course, it was considerably less orderly. College life in the 18th century had a reputation, fair in many respects, for late nights, much drinking, and considerable disregard for the prescribed hours of study and rest. The undergraduates of Oxford and Cambridge were, in this period, largely young men of good family who were there as much for the social experience as for the education, and they arranged their nights accordingly. But in the quieter corners of college life, in the rooms of the serious scholars, the fellows who had committed their lives to a particular field and were grinding away at it by the light of whatever candles the college allowed, the nights were genuinely studious. These men worked when they could, which was often late and sometimes very late, and they slept when the work was done, which was sometimes not until the sky was already growing pale in the east. The Scottish universities, Edinburgh above all, had a different and in many ways more interesting character in this period. Edinburgh in the 18th century was in the middle of what is now called the Scottish Enlightenment, a remarkable flowering of intellectual life that produced David Hume and Adam Smith and James Hutton, and a constellation of other thinkers whose work shaped the modern world. The University of Edinburgh was at the center of this, a place of genuine intellectual excitement, with students who came from all over Britain and beyond to study medicine and philosophy and law. The students of Edinburgh, many of whom were studying medicine, kept long hours in a different way from the Oxford gentlemen scholars. They attended clinical demonstrations at the infirmary in the early morning. They dissected bodies in the anatomy schools, a practice that required considerable determination to maintain cheerfulness about, given the conditions. They attended lectures and wrote up notes and argued in the evenings about what they had seen and read. And they slept when they could, in the chilly lodging houses that clustered around the university, in rooms that smelled of coal smoke and damp plaster, and the particular mustiness of accumulated learning. The question of how to sleep productively, how to arrange one's sleep to maximize intellectual output, was one that the scholars of the Enlightenment thought about with the same systematic interest they brought to everything else. The idea of sleeping on a problem was not new. The tradition of incubation, sleeping in a sacred space in the hope of receiving divine guidance, goes back to ancient Greece. But the Enlightenment had secularized this and rationalized it, turning it from a religious practice into a cognitive strategy. The observation was that problems which had resisted conscious, deliberate thought sometimes yielded to the mind after a night's sleep. You went to bed stuck, and you woke up with the solution, or at least with a new angle on the problem that had not occurred to you before. This experience was common enough that it attracted serious attention from those who were interested in how the mind works. The explanation offered was that the mind, freed from the discipline of directed thought during sleep, ranged more freely among the contents of memory and imagination, making connections that the wakeful, focused intellect would not permit. The dream mind or the sleeping mind, or whatever you called the cognitive activity that happened during sleep, played more openly, followed associations, without insisting they be rational, tried combinations that the waking mind would reject as implausible, found its way to solutions through paths that were not available to deliberate reasoning. This explanation has considerable modern support. What we now call consolidation, the brain's process of integrating and organizing new information during sleep, is a real and important part of learning and problem solving. The scholars of the Enlightenment were noticing something genuine, even if their account of the mechanism was imprecise. Some of them began deliberately to use this, noting the problem clearly before bed, thinking about it but not too hard, allowing the mind to turn it over gently as sleep approached. Keeping paper and a pen nearby to record the thoughts that came in the night or in the early morning waking, before the rational daytime mind had fully reassembled itself and dismissed them. This practice is still recommended by people who study sleep and creativity. It is satisfying to find it already in use in the 18th century, in the candlelit studies of men who were trying, by every means available to them, to know more than they had known before. The colonies, the plantations, and the sleep that was stolen, ambient, the sound of night in an unfamiliar climate, cicadas, a frog, the heavy warmth of air that does not cool distant water. We cannot tell the full story of sleep in the Age of Enlightenment without going to a place that the Enlightenment's own self-portrait preferred to ignore: the American colonies, the Caribbean plantations, the vast, brutal enterprise of Atlantic slavery. The Enlightenment proclaimed, with great confidence and considerable eloquence, the rights of man, the freedom of the individual, the dignity of human reason. These were its most cherished ideas, the ones that inspired revolutions and constitutions and declarations that echo still. And at the same time, the same civilization that was producing Voltaire and Locke and Hume and the Encyclopedia was operating the largest forced labor system the world had ever seen, one that depended on the complete denial of those rights to millions of human beings. We need to sit with this contradiction for a moment. We need to hold it because it is real and important, and because it shaped the sleep, the actual physical nighttime sleep, of a vast number of human beings whose stories the history of ideas tends to pass over. The cicadas in the ambient continue. The night is very warm. The enslaved people of the American South and the Caribbean plantations slept in conditions that were shaped entirely by the requirements of their enslavers. On the sugar plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, St. Domingue, and the other Caribbean islands, the work cycle of sugar production was among the most brutal ever devised. The cutting of cane, the crushing, the boiling, these required labor around the clock during the harvest season. Workers were organized into shifts, working and sleeping in rotation, but the total hours of sleep available to them were severely limited by the demands of the work. During crop time, the months of harvest, enslaved workers on sugar plantations might sleep 3 or 4 hours a night, sometimes less. They slept in the barracks or the huts that planters provided, communal spaces with earthen floors and minimal protection from the elements. In the tropical heat, these spaces were stifling in the hours before dawn when the air did not move. In the occasional cold fronts that reached even the tropics in winter, they could be bitter without adequate covering. Bodies of enslaved people, pushed to these limits of work and sleep deprivation, paid the price that all bodies pay for such treatment. The mortality rates on Caribbean sugar plantations were catastrophic. Life expectancy for enslaved workers on the most demanding islands was measured in years from arrival, not in decades. The planters knew this, and they calculated accordingly, factoring the cost of replacement workers into their books as a business expense. This is not comfortable history. It is not designed to be, but it is part of the story of how people slept in the 18th century, and it cannot be omitted. In the American South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, the pattern of sleep was somewhat different because tobacco and cotton and rice production, while brutal, did not require quite the same kind of around-the-clock intensity as Caribbean sugar. The enslaved people on southern plantations were typically given a specified period of nighttime rest, from some hour in the evening until an hour before dawn that would allow them to reach the fields before the workday began. This was a concession not to human decency but to basic productivity. A completely exhausted laborer cannot work effectively. They slept in the slave quarters, small cabins built at the margins of the plantation, clustered together in rows. These cabins varied in quality and comfort depending on the relative prosperity of the plantation and the inclinations of the enslaver, but they were generally small, often overcrowded, and equipped with minimal furniture. Sleeping platforms or simple pallets, shared blankets, an open hearth for warmth in winter. In these cabins, in the hours between the day's end and the dawn's demand, something happened that the Enlightenment's philosophers of human nature did not fully account for in their theories. Communities formed and sustained themselves, and created the conditions for a life that was not just endurance. Music was made, stories were told. The oral traditions that had been carried across the Atlantic, the folk stories, the religious practices, the knowledge of plants and healing, the memories of another world were kept alive in the nighttime hours. The cabins were not simply places of rest. They were the spaces in which culture survived. This is not to romanticize the conditions of enslavement. There was nothing romantic about them. But it is to say that the human spirit, even in the most constrained and brutal of circumstances, finds its way to expression, and that the nighttime hours, the hours of relative privacy that even the most controlled system could not entirely eliminate, were where much of that expression happened. The cicadas are quieter now. The night is, if anything, warmer. But the sound has shifted slightly, something like distant singing, formless and half-heard and then gone. The enslaved people of the 18th century were, in one important sense, the Enlightenment's most devastating contradiction. The Enlightenment's philosophers argued for the universality of human reason, for the natural rights that accrued to all rational beings. They used these arguments to challenge the authority of kings and churches, to demand religious toleration, to lay the intellectual groundwork for democratic revolution. And they performed various intellectual contortions to explain why these arguments did not apply to Africans. They invoked climate theory, the idea that hot climates produced different, less rational human types. They invoked the supposed natural hierarchy of human development. They invoked a great deal of bad science and worse reasoning to justify something that their own principles condemned. Some of them knew this. Some of the sharpest minds of the Enlightenment recognized and named the contradiction Montesquieu in France, whose satirical treatment of the arguments for slavery in his Spirit of the Laws is devastating in its irony. The Abbé Raynal, whose History of European Colonialism was one of the most widely read works of the century, and whose condemnation of the slave trade was unambiguous. The small but determined anti-slavery movement that was growing in England through the latter decades of the century and would eventually produce abolition. But recognition, even eloquent recognition, is not action, and the plantation system continued, and the people in it slept their limited sleep in their cabins and their barracks, and their lives continued to be what they were. The Enlightenment wanted to understand everything. It did not always want to see everything. These are not the same thing. Sleep in medicine, insomnia and its remedies, ambient, the sound of an apothecary's shop, perhaps glass clinking very softly, the smell of herbs suggested through sound, a fire burning low in a small space, and as the night deepens, let us talk about when sleep did not come. Insomnia is not a modern invention. People have been unable to sleep in every century and every civilization for as long as there have been people. The causes have varied: anxiety, pain, illness, grief, hunger, noise, cold, heat, but the experience of lying awake when you wish to be sleeping is one of the most universal in human experience. The 18th century knew insomnia well, and it had remedies. The physician's first-line treatment for insomnia in this period was behavioral, what we might now call sleep hygiene, though the language would have been different. Exercise was the beginning. Adequate physical exercise during the day was held to be essential for sound sleep at night. The body that had worked hard was a body that needed and deserved rest. The body that had sat all day in a study or a shop or a parlor was a body that had not spent itself sufficiently, and it would pay the price in the nighttime hours. This advice was often given to those who did not need it, the agricultural laborers and urban workers who were already exhausted from physical labor, and withheld, or given with less emphasis, from those who most did. The scholar with his insomnia was more often told to moderate his intellectual efforts than to go for a vigorous walk, which might have helped him more. Diet, as we have discussed, was the second behavioral intervention. Eating lightly in the evenings. Avoiding strong drink in large quantities. Choosing foods that were easy to digest. drinking the warm posset or the small cup of wine that would settle the nerves without stimulating them. The sleeping environment was the third. The bedroom should be cool but not cold, and opinions varied considerably on the correct temperature, with some physicians advocating very cold rooms as conducive to deep sleep, and others concerned that cold air would produce congestion and inflammatory illness. The bed should be firm but not hard. The pillow should not be so high as to bend the neck into an uncomfortable position, nor so low as to allow the head to fall back and obstruct breathing. The room should be dark and quiet. This last requirement, quiet, was one that many 18th century urban dwellers found genuinely difficult to meet. The cities were noisy at night. London in particular was notorious for its nocturnal racket, the calling of night watchmen, the clattering of carriages, the sounds of the river, the various industries that worked through the night, the dogs and horses, and the whole enormous mechanical noise of a city of 1 million people that never entirely stopped. Sleep masks were not used, but ear protection of a sort was practiced, pulling the bedclothes over the ears, stuffing the ears with wool in extreme cases, arranging the bed so that the sleeper's head was as far as possible from the window. These were practical solutions to a practical problem, and they reflected the same basic understanding we have now. External noise disturbs sleep, and anything you can do to reduce it is worth doing. The glass in the ambient clinks once more, very softly, then nothing. When behavioral remedies failed, the 18th century turned to medical ones. Laudanum we have already met. It was the first resort of serious insomnia, and it was effective, and it was dangerous, and these two facts were not fully reconciled in this period. Beyond laudanum, the apothecary's shelf held a range of herbal preparations that had been used for sleep since ancient times and are still recognized as having some sedative effect. Valerian root, a plant whose roots produce a compound that is mildly sedative, was prepared as a tea or a tincture and recommended for nervous disorders and sleeplessness. The smell of valerian is somewhat challenging, earthy, musty, with a quality that cats find irresistible, but its effects were real enough that it remained a standard remedy through the century. Hops, the same plant that flavors beer, and which was used heavily in the 18th century's considerable beer production, were also recognized as sedative. The pillows stuffed with dried hops that appear in folk remedies from this period are based on a genuine observation. The compounds produced by hops as they dry have mild sedative properties, and sleeping with your head on a hops pillow is probably slightly more effective than nothing. Chamomile, lavender, lemon balm, all the gentle, sweetly scented herbs of the English cottage garden, were prepared as teas and infusions and used for sleep. The evidence for their effectiveness varies, but the ritual of preparing them, the kettle, the warm cup, the particular scent, was itself calming, and the calming effect of ritual is real regardless of the pharmacological action of the substance. The physicians of the Enlightenment were, in this area, doing what physicians always do, combining genuine chemical knowledge with a significant amount of hope, and presenting both with the same confident bedside manner. There was one approach to sleeplessness that was distinctly Enlightenment in character, and that deserves particular attention. The century believed with genuine conviction that sleeplessness was often a disease of the mind, specifically of the kind of overactive, overstimulated mind that the intellectual culture of the age produced. The person who could not sleep was often the person who thought too much, who worried too precisely, who could not let the mind rest even when the body was ready to do so. The recommended remedy for this kind of insomnia was not always pharmaceutical. It was often what the physicians called the regulation of the passions, the cultivation of a calm and balanced mental life, the avoidance of strong emotion, particularly anxiety, anger, and the intense excitement of intellectual work carried too close to bedtime. The ideal they were reaching for was something like equanimity, the Stoic concept of a mind that is not disturbed by external events because it has learned to hold them at a certain distance, to observe them rather than be driven by them. This was excellent advice. It was also, as the restless, passionate, argumentative personalities of the Enlightenment demonstrated daily, very difficult to follow. Samuel Johnson, again, provides an instructive case. Johnson knew that his insomnia was partly a product of his own anxiety, his fear of death, his religious uncertainty, his guilt over perceived failures of duty and devotion. He tried to address this. He prayed. He attempted to regulate his thoughts in the evenings, to avoid dwelling on the things that most disturbed him. He kept careful records of his mental state in his diaries, noting with painful honesty the nights when he had managed to be tranquil and the nights when he had not. He did not, on the whole, succeed in being consistently tranquil. He was too alive, too anxious, too much in love with the world, and too afraid of losing it to achieve the philosopher's equanimity. But he tried. And the trying itself, the conscious, honest, daily effort to manage his own mind, was itself an Enlightenment act. He was applying reason to the study of his own interior life, using the tools of observation and record-keeping to understand himself, just as the natural philosophers were using those tools to understand the external world. The difference is that the external world eventually yielded to those tools. Samuel Johnson's anxiety did not. The salons of Paris and the art of late conversation, ambient, the very faint sound of a French city at night, distant voices, a carriage somewhere, the particular quiet that descends on cobblestones after the main part of the evening's activity has concluded. Paris in the 18th century was the intellectual capital of Europe. This was not just French vanity, it was a widely shared perception across the continent, and it was reflected in the extraordinary concentration of brilliant minds that the city attracted and produced. And Paris had a particular institution that shaped both its intellectual life and its relationship with sleep: the salon. The salon in this context, a regular gathering in a private home, hosted typically by a woman of education and social standing, for the purpose of conversation and the exchange of ideas, was one of the defining institutions of the French Enlightenment. The salonnières, the women who hosted these gatherings, were figures of considerable power and influence. Marie Thérèse Rodin-Geoffrin, Julie de Lespinasse, Susan Necker, the Marquise du Deffand, these women had names, and those names opened doors, and the gatherings they hosted shaped which ideas got attention, and which books got published, and which thinkers got the introductions that advanced their careers. The salons met in the evenings. Not the early evening, the French dined late by Northern European standards, and the post-dinner conversation that was the salon's primary activity did not begin until 9 or 10 in the evening. It might continue until 1, 2, or 3 in the morning. This was simply how Parisian intellectual life worked. If you were part of it, you kept late hours. You ate dinner at 9. You arrived at the salon at 10 or 11. You talked until the candles burned low and the fire guttered, and the hostess, however engaged she had been in the conversation, finally showed signs of tiredness that could not be ignored. And then you went home through the Paris streets, if you were a man of sufficient status, in a carriage, or on foot if you were not, and you went to bed, in whatever accommodation you had, at an hour that was often past 3 in the morning. And you woke whenever you woke, and you did it all again. The distant voices in the ambient resolve, briefly, into something almost conversational, a quick rise and fall of animated speech, then fading back into the general sound of the night. The intellectual content of the salons was, by almost every account, extraordinary. These were rooms where the great questions of the age were argued with passion and wit and genuine knowledge, where Voltaire and Diderot and D'Alembert and Turgot and Condorcet and dozens of others exchanged ideas that were changing the world. But what we are interested in, on this particular evening, is the physical reality of these gatherings, the late hour. The heated rooms for Parisian winters are cold, and the salons were well heated, both for comfort and for the good reason that cold people do not think or talk as well. The brilliant conversation that continued, fueled by coffee and wine, and the particular excitement of being in a room full of people who are thinking as fast and as well as you are. And then the walk home through the dark. Paris at midnight in the 18th century was not a safe city. It was not the Parisian midnight of romantic imagination, lamplit bridges and café au lait, and the slow river gliding by. It was a medieval city still, in its bones, cramped and dark, and not always hospitable to the philosopher making his way home after a long evening's conversation. The streets were badly lit. They were sometimes actively dangerous, not in a dramatic way typically, but in the way of any large city at any time, where late-night streets are less supervised, and those who use them may have various intentions. But the men of the salons, and it was largely men who made the late walks home, women generally being escorted to their carriages, were accustomed to it. They walked and they continued to think. The conversation that had just ended continued in the head, taking new turns that the presence of other people had not allowed, running out to conclusions that the salon's collective intelligence had not quite reached. The best thinking of the Paris salons probably happened on the walk home. The salonnières themselves had a rather different relationship to these late evenings. The hostess of a salon had responsibilities that did not end when the guests arrived. She had to manage the conversation, steering it away from topics that would produce conflict rather than illumination, drawing out the shyer guests, gently curbing the more performatively brilliant ones who tended to dominate if left unchecked. She had to attend to the physical logistics of the room, the refreshments, the seating, the comfort of people who might be sitting for 3 or 4 hours in the same spot. And she had to be brilliant herself, or at least appear to be, because a salonnière who could not hold her own in conversation was not a salonnière for long. All of this while tired in many cases, because the salonnières were not generally women of leisure, however it might appear. They had households to run, letters to write, relationships to maintain. The salon was one activity among many, not the leisure activity of a woman with nothing else to do. Marquise du Deffand, who hosted one of the most celebrated salons of the mid-18th century, was plagued by insomnia for much of her adult life. She wrote about it in her letters with a particular combination of resignation and black humor that was very much her characteristic register. She was going blind, she lost her sight entirely in her 50s, and the loss of reading, which had been her main comfort and occupation, made the sleepless nights harder to bear. She lay in the dark, a dark that was now permanent rather than merely nocturnal, and she thought about the conversations of the salon, about the friends she was losing to death and distance, about her life, its choices and its regrets, about whether there was anything to hope for in a future that was growing shorter and darker, and whether hope was even a rational attitude at all. She wrote to Voltaire about these nights. She wrote to Horace Walpole, the English writer who became one of the great correspondences of her later life. She wrote letters of such intelligence and such melancholy that they still arrest the reader 3 centuries on. The Enlightenment was not always a cheerful enterprise. At 3 in the morning, lying blind in the dark, having exhausted the day's conversation and found no relief in sleep, the project of knowing everything could seem considerably less inspiring than it did in the brilliant afternoon light of the salon. But she kept going. She kept the salon. She kept the correspondence. She kept thinking. This too is a form of courage. The ambient shifts gently, the Paris sounds fade, and in their place comes the deeper quiet of a late autumn night, with wind and the suggestion of distant countryside. The rural night ambient, the sounds of rural England or France at night, a barn owl somewhere very distant, the wind moving through fields, the low sound of a fire in a farmhouse, the occasional sound of a sleeping animal. For all the time we have spent in cities, in London and Paris and Edinburgh, and aboard ships on dark water, we should remember that most people in the 18th century did not live in cities. Most people lived in the countryside. In villages and hamlets and isolated farmhouses, and the small market towns that served the agricultural hinterlands. And in the countryside, sleep was shaped by the rhythms of the natural world in a way that was more complete and more immediate than anything the city dweller experienced. The agricultural laborer's night began when the work ended and the light failed. There was no artificial light to extend the day, or there was very little, and it was expensive. Tallow candles were not a luxury the poor spent money on if they could avoid it. The firelight of the hearth was enough to see by for an hour or 2 in the evening, for the mending and the conversation and the small tasks that could be done by firelight. And then the fire died down and the room grew dark and you slept. You slept, in winter, for a very long time. In England and France, a winter night might run to 16 hours or more, from 4 in the afternoon until 8 the next morning if you were following the sun. Agricultural laborers did not generally sleep all 16 hours. They slept their 2 sleeps, with the midnight waking in between. But they were in bed, or at least in their sleeping place, for the duration of the dark. In summer, the balance reversed. The days were long, extraordinarily long at high latitudes, where midsummer twilight might not fully fade until 10 or 11 at night, and the dawn came at 3 or 4 in the morning. In these conditions, the agricultural laborer slept for perhaps 5 or 6 hours, and worked in the long light of morning and evening, and slept again in the short darkness in between. This was not insomnia. This was the ancient human rhythm of seasonal sleeping, calibrated not to an alarm clock but to the sun. The human body is genuinely light-sensitive in ways that are only beginning to be well understood by science. Our circadian rhythms evolved in conditions of natural light, and the length of the night is one of the primary signals our bodies use to determine when to sleep and how much. The rural people of the 18th century were, in this sense, more in alignment with their own biology than most modern people. They were not perfectly rested. Hard physical labor takes its toll, and poor nutrition and physical illness and the cold were constant companions. But they were sleeping in a way that was, fundamentally, calibrated to the world they actually lived in. The barn owl calls once, closer now than silence. The wind moves through the field. The farmhouse itself was a different sleeping environment from the city dwelling, and it is worth describing it in some detail. The farmhouse of a middling English or French family in the 18th century was typically built of local materials, stone in the upland regions, half-timbered in the lowlands, brick where brick was available and affordable. The structure was low and thick-walled, built for warmth, not for grandeur. The ceilings were low, 7 feet was tall for a farmhouse, and many had ceilings that required tall men to duck through doorways. The rooms were few. In the simplest farmhouses, there might be only 2, the main room, which served as kitchen and living space, and the sleeping room. Or there might be 3 or 4, with a clear distinction between the sleeping quarters of the family and those of any farm laborers who lived in. The sleeping room of a farmhouse was a warm room in winter, because it shared a wall with the chimney stack that heated the main room below. The heat of the fire conducted through the stone and radiated into the sleeping space, gently, throughout the night. In severe cold, a warming pan, a metal pan filled with coals, run between the sheets before bed, might be used to take the chill off the linen. And the livestock, quartered in the barn that was often attached directly to the house or very nearby, contributed their considerable body heat to the warmth of the whole structure. Animals sleep nearby. This was the normal condition of rural life. The sounds of the barn, the shifting of horses, the low sound of cattle, the occasional cluck of a disturbed hen were the familiar sounds of the rural night. They were not alarming. They were, in a sense, comforting. The animals' quiet breathing and slow movements were evidence of life continuing, of the world in order, of the things that sustained the family's existence doing what they were supposed to do. The countryside at night, for someone living in it, was not silent. It was full of sounds, but they were sounds that were known, categorized, understood. The tawny owl that hunted the field margins, the fox calling from the wood, the dog chained in the yard, whose alarm bark you learned to distinguish from his ordinary evening restlessness, the wind, which spoke differently in different seasons, and whose voice you had been hearing all your life. This is very different from the city's noise, which was often genuinely disruptive precisely because it was random and unpredictable. The carriage that rattled over the cobblestones at 2 a.m, the drunk who sang in the street, the fire bell that rang somewhere in the distance. The countryside's night sounds, however numerous, followed patterns, and the sleeping mind could filter out the patterned and familiar, attending only to the genuinely unusual. The religious dimension of the rural night was more present, more immediate than in the cities. The village church was the center of rural life in a way that no urban church could quite replicate. Its bells regulated the hours, calling the community to worship, marking the major transitions of the day, ringing in births and deaths and the great festivals of the year. The sound of the church bells at nightfall was one of the reliable structures of the rural day's end. It said, "This portion of time is concluded." The next portion is rest. Many rural people prayed before sleep with a regularity and a sincerity that was different from the more self-conscious devotional practices of the educated urban classes. Not because rural people were more religious in any simple sense, belief is complicated in every class and every setting, but because the prayer that frames the end of the day is a practical act as much as a spiritual one. It is the act of putting the day down, of releasing the concerns of the waking hours to something larger and more patient, of acknowledging that the self that goes to sleep is not in control of what happens next. This is a useful acknowledgement. It is one that the Enlightenment's rational culture found somewhat difficult to make. The emphasis on human reason and human agency sat uncomfortably with the idea of relinquishing control. But the rural people, closer to the unpredictable rhythms of weather and harvest and birth and death, had fewer illusions about control. They prayed because the prayer was honest, and then they slept in the warmth of the thick-walled house, with the animals breathing in the barn next door, and the church bell long silent, and the dark complete and unqualified and patient. The New World and its sleepers, ambient, a colonial American night, crickets, cicadas, the sound of a wooden house settling in the summer heat, a distant church bell in the style of New England. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, across the Atlantic, the world was being made new. Or that, at least, was how many of the people who lived there understood it. The American colonies of the 18th century were a project of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary contradiction. They were built on land that had been taken from its original inhabitants. They were worked in their southern portions by people who had been taken from theirs, and they were inhabited in their towns and farms and cities by people who believed, many of them genuinely, passionately, and with considerable philosophical sophistication, that they were building something better. Something that the old world, weighted down by its kings and its traditions and its established churches, could not produce. And in the evenings, after the work of the day was done, they slept. The sleep of colonial America was shaped by conditions that were both familiar and completely new. Familiar because the colonists brought with them all the assumptions and habits of the European cultures they had come from: the English, the Dutch, the Germans, the Scots-Irish, the French Huguenots. They understood beds and bedrooms and the rituals of evening in the ways their homelands had taught them. New because the environment was different. The climate of the American colonies varied enormously, from the frigid winters of Massachusetts to the subtropical summers of South Carolina, and none of the settlers had been prepared for this variety by their experience at home. The New England winter was more severe than anything most English settlers had expected. The cold was punishing, the snow was deep, and the houses of the early colonial period were poorly insulated by any standard, being built quickly out of the most available materials by people who had more urgent priorities than thermal efficiency. The cold that settled in a New England farmhouse in January was a serious physical challenge, and surviving it required all the communal sleeping strategies that we have already described: multiple bodies in beds, heavy quilts and blankets made from every scrap of fabric that could be spared, fires kept burning through the night when possible, The New England quilts of this period were not just decorative objects, they were survival equipment. And they were often made communally, at the quilting bees, that were one of the characteristic social institutions of colonial New England, women gathering to work together on the heavy, multi-layered structures that would keep their families alive through the winter. The crickets in the ambient deepened slightly, then quiet. The southern colonies had the inverse problem. The heat of a Virginia or Carolina summer was not something the English settlers had any experience of, and it produced sleep difficulties that were new to them, and for which their medical traditions offered limited guidance. The plantation houses of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas were built with a consciousness of heat that their English models did not share. Wide porches, known in this period by various regional names, ran along the fronts and sides of houses to provide shade and catch breezes. The ceilings of the main rooms were higher than in England, allowing the hottest air to rise away from the people below. Windows were positioned to create cross-ventilation, and in the evenings, when the day's work was done, families often moved their most private activities, conversation, reading, and eventually sleep, to wherever the air moved. Sleeping on the porch or with the windows fully open and the mosquito netting drawn was common in summer. The mosquito netting, a fine gauze curtain hung around the bed, was a direct adaptation to the American South's insect life, and it was one of the most important pieces of bedding equipment in any Southern household that could afford it. Benjamin Franklin, one of the great polymaths of the American Enlightenment, whose interests ranged from electricity to printing to diplomacy to medicine, wrote at some length about sleep and ventilation. He was a convinced believer in the value of fresh, cool air for sleep, and he was willing to go to considerable lengths to achieve it, sleeping with windows open even in weather that others considered too cold, arguing in his typically direct and empirical way that stuffy rooms produced poor sleep, and that the remedy was always more air, not less. He was not wrong. But he was also writing from the perspective of a man who did not share a bedroom with someone who disagreed. The religious communities of colonial America, the Puritans of New England, the Quakers of Pennsylvania, the various German pietist groups of the Middle Colonies, had their own particular approaches to sleep that were worth noting. The Puritan tradition, descended from the English Calvinist movement of the previous century, took sleep seriously as a moral category. You were supposed to rise early. You were supposed not to waste the daylight hours in bed. The very word sloth, which appeared regularly in Puritan sermons and spiritual diaries, carried connotations of excessive sleep as well as of laziness more generally. The Puritan kept a spiritual diary in which they recorded not just their actions but their inner life, their temptations, their failings, their moments of grace. And the quality of their sleep was part of this record. A restless, dream-troubled night was evidence of spiritual disturbance. Quiet, refreshed waking was evidence of divine favor. The night's sleep was read, like every other experience, as a text in which the divine will was, if you were attentive enough, legible. The Quakers had a different relationship to sleep, less anxious, more open to the quiet that sleep represented. The Quaker tradition valued silence as a form of spiritual attention, and the nightly silence of sleep was not a problem to be managed, but a gift to be received. You lay down and you were still, and in the stillness something might happen, a dream that was not just a dream, a moment of clarity in the borderland between waking and sleeping, and you noted it. And you brought it back to the meeting, and the community discerned together whether it was genuine leadings or merely the wanderings of the unquiet mind. The German pietist communities, the Mennonites and Moravians and various other groups who settled in Pennsylvania and later pushed into the interior, had their own complex relationship with the night and its experiences. The Moravians in particular had an elaborate theology of dreams and visions that was in some tension with the Enlightenment's rationalizing tendencies. They believed that the Holy Spirit could communicate through the dream, could visit the sleeper with genuine spiritual content, could use the night's loosening of rational control to reach the soul directly. This was not the Enlightenment's preferred answer to the question of what dreams were. But it was held with genuine conviction by people who were building communities and living lives of real seriousness, and it shaped their nights in ways that the rational philosophers of the salons would have found both strange and fascinating. The medicine of sleep, revisited, ambient. The sound of a physician's consulting room, very quiet, with the ticking of a clock, the faint sound of rain on the window, a fire burning carefully in a small grate. Let us return to the physician's study. It is later in the century, later in the evening. The fire has been rebuilt. The physician has been working for several hours on a paper that he is preparing for the local philosophical society, and the paper is about sleep. He has read everything that has been written on the subject, or as much as he can find, which is a considerable amount. He has read the ancient authorities, Galen and Hippocrates, whose theories of humors and temperaments still had influence, though they were increasingly being questioned. He has read the moderns, Boerhaave and Hoffmann and Witt and Cullen, the great systematic physicians of the 18th century who had tried to build comprehensive theories of the body's function. And he has kept notes over the years on his own patients and their sleep. He is a careful observer. He has noted the patterns: the wealthy who could not sleep for worry, the poor who could not sleep for pain, the elderly who woke in the early hours and could not return to sleep, the young who slept as deeply as the dead and woke as easily as sunlight. He has noticed that sleep is rarely simple, that it is almost always connected to everything else in a person's life: their habits, their circumstances, their relationships, their fears, their pleasures. That the person who comes to him complaining of insomnia is almost never suffering from just insomnia, from a simple inability to sleep that has no wider context. The rain against the window becomes a steady, gentle sound. The 18th century developed, in the later decades of the period, an increasing interest in what we might now call the psychology of sleep disturbance. The recognition that the mind, not just the body, but the mind, with its memories and fears and hopes and grief, was a major determinant of sleep quality. The Scottish physician William Cullen, who taught at Edinburgh and whose work influenced a generation of physicians on both sides of the Atlantic, wrote about the nervous system with a sophistication that was unusual for the period. He recognized that the nervous system was not just a messenger service, carrying commands from the brain to the muscles and sensations from the body to the brain, but a complex, integrated system that was deeply affected by emotional experience. What Cullen called the passions, the emotions, had direct effects on the nervous system. Anxiety produced a state of nervous overstimulation that was incompatible with sleep. Grief, similarly, kept the nervous system in a state of heightened reactivity that could persist for weeks or months. Even positive, strong emotion, great excitement, intense joy, could prevent sleep, though this was a less common complaint. The treatment Cullen recommended for emotionally driven insomnia was partly pharmacological and partly what we might now call supportive. The physician was supposed to listen, to understand the patient's situation, to help them find a perspective on their troubles that was less agitating. This is a remarkable prefiguring of psychotherapeutic practice. Cullen understood intuitively that the way a person thought about their situation, the stories they told themselves about it, was partly responsible for the physiological state that prevented sleep. If you could change the story, you might change the sleeplessness. This was not always possible. And Cullen did not think it was always possible. He was a realist. Some situations did not have better stories available to them. Some griefs and some fears were appropriate to the circumstances that had produced them, and no amount of rational reframing would make them less real. In those cases, he turned to laudanum with perhaps less reluctance than a modern physician would. The suffering was real. The remedy was effective. The risks were understood to exist, but so was the suffering. This was the calculation that the 18th century made, and it was not always a wrong one. There was a debate in the later decades of the 18th century about the relationship between civilization itself and the quality of sleep. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued, in his provocative and influential way, that civilization had corrupted natural man, had taken a creature born good and free, and subjected him to the distorting pressures of society and competition and artificial wants, extended this argument, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to the domain of sleep. Natural man, Rousseau suggested, slept as animals sleep, deeply, easily, refreshingly, without the troubled dreams and midnight anxieties that afflicted the civilized person. The savage, the word was his, and he meant it as a compliment, lay down on the ground under the stars and slept until he was rested and then woke refreshed, untormented by guilt or ambition or the complex social calculations that kept the educated European tossing in his expensive bed. This was largely romanticized nonsense, as many of Rousseau's claims about natural man were, but it pointed towards something that was also partly true, that the complexity of 18th century civilized life produced a kind of mental overstimulation that made sleep difficult, and that simpler lives, with fewer anxieties of the specifically social and intellectual kind, might produce better sleep. The physicians, reading Rousseau with varying degrees of sympathy, generally agreed with the diagnosis if not the remedy. Yes, the overstimulation of civilized life was bad for sleep. Yes, a simpler, more regulated life would probably produce more regular and more restoring sleep. But Rousseau's solution, returning to a pre-social state of nature, was neither possible nor desirable. The solution had to be found within civilization, not in its rejection. What the physicians offered in response was essentially what we would now call lifestyle advice: regular hours, moderate diet, adequate exercise, limited stimulants, the cultivation of a calm and regulated mental life, a willingness to put the day's concerns down genuinely and finally at the hour of sleep. This was sensible advice. It remains sensible. It was then, as now, easier to prescribe than to practice. The body clocks of the Enlightenment, ambient, The very quiet sound of a room in which a clock ticks slow, steady, inevitable, and outside. The sound of a city at perhaps 2 or 3 in the morning, very reduced from its daytime noise but not entirely still. And as the night deepens, the 18th century was fascinated by clocks. Not as a metaphor, though the mechanistic philosophers did use the clock as a metaphor for the body, for the universe, for God's relationship to creation. But literally as objects. The watchmaker's craft was one of the most admired of the age. The tiny, intricate mechanisms that measured time, escapements and balance wheels and hairsprings and gear trains of exquisite precision, were objects of genuine wonder. They proved, by their very existence, that nature's complexity could be reproduced in miniature by human ingenuity. And this fascination with mechanical timekeeping was accompanied by an increasing interest in biological time, the rhythms of the body, the regular oscillations of the natural world that seemed to echo, in living systems, the regularity of the mechanical clock. The Enlightenment observed that many plants and animals followed regular daily rhythms. Carolus Linnaeus, the great Swedish botanist who gave us the system of classification still used today, planted a garden at Uppsala that functioned as a living clock. He had observed that different flowers opened and closed at different times of day with remarkable precision, and he arranged them so that you could tell the hour with reasonable accuracy, simply by walking through the garden and noticing which flowers were open. The dandelion opened at 5 in the morning, the hawkweed at 7. The water lily at 8, the marigold at 9. As the day progressed, each flower took its appointed hour, and in the late afternoon and evening, the reverse process, closing, withdrawing, preparing for the night, was equally precise. This was beautiful. It was also, for the naturalists of the age, scientifically significant. It meant that living organisms carried within themselves some mechanism for keeping time, some internal process that was sensitive to the progression of the day independently of the actual amount of light or temperature, though those were the most obvious external signals. The investigation of this phenomenon, we now call it circadian rhythm, from the Latin for approximately a day, was just beginning in the 18th century. The French astronomer Jean-Jacques de Marin had in 1729 performed a simple but elegant experiment with a mimosa plant. He put the plant in a dark room, completely isolating it from any light cues, and the leaves of the mimosa continued to open and close on their daily rhythm, even in complete darkness. The rhythm was internal. It was not simply a response to the light. Something inside the plant was keeping time. This finding was noted and then somewhat set aside in the 18th century, partly because there was no framework to make sense of it. The mechanistic physiology of the age could account for a great deal, but it had no ready explanation for a living clock, a biological mechanism that could track the progression of time independently of any obvious external input. The explanation would come much later. But the observation was made, and it was correct, and it pointed toward a truth that shapes all sleep. The body knows what time it is. The clock in the ambient ticks on, slow and steady. For the people sleeping in the 18th century, the philosopher in his study, the servant in the attic, the sailor in his hammock, the enslaved worker in the plantation cabin, the salonnière in her Paris apartment, the body's internal clock was a reality they lived with every day, even if they had no language for it. They felt the pull of sleep at a particular hour. They felt the push of waking at another. The interlude of the midnight waking was, as we have discussed, often a regular feature of the night, happening at roughly the same time, corresponding to a biological transition between sleep stages that their bodies performed automatically. They felt the mid-afternoon drowsiness that is now recognized as a feature of human circadian biology, the dip in alertness that comes in the early afternoon, not because of lunch, though that is an easy and tempting explanation, but because of the body's internal rhythm, which has a secondary period of reduced alertness approximately 12 hours after the primary one at night. Many cultures, including those of the Mediterranean and the tropics, had institutionalized this afternoon sleep as the siesta. The North European tradition was more ambivalent about it. Sleeping in the afternoon was sometimes associated with laziness, with the moral failing of the slothful, but the physicians generally recognized it as natural and, in moderation, beneficial. Samuel Johnson napped in the afternoon when he could. Voltaire took afternoon rest regularly. Even the energetic Benjamin Franklin, who wrote so much about early rising and the moral virtue of not wasting time in bed, acknowledged that a short afternoon rest could be beneficial to the working of the mind. The body's clock does not care about the moralizing of the age. It continues to mark its rhythms regardless of what the philosophers think about napping. The long night passes, ambient, the sound of a night that has reached its deepest point, past 3 in the morning perhaps, when the city has reached its maximum quiet, when the first birds have not yet stirred, when the darkness is absolute and the cold is at its most complete. Let us stay here for a moment. In the deep of the night, past the midnight waking. In the dark hours between the first and second sleep, when the city is quiet and the countryside is quieter still, and the world has pulled back from the urgency of the day into the essential anonymity of sleep. All over the Enlightenment's world, at this same hour, people are sleeping. In Edinburgh, in a tall, narrow tenement on the high street, a medical student has fallen asleep over his notes. The candle has burned down to the stub and extinguished itself, and the room has gone dark around him, and he has not noticed because he was already, at the moment of extinction, deeply asleep. His head rests on the notes he was reading, and the ink has transferred very faintly from paper to cheek. He will wake in a few hours, stiff-necked and cold, and think briefly that the strange half-darkness of the room means it is close to dawn, and then he will look at his watch and see it is only 2, and he will make the decision that every student makes in this moment, to go to his bed properly or to continue, and he will go to his bed and he will sleep until 8, and he will feel, when he wakes, enormously better. In a farmhouse in Burgundy, a family is asleep in the warm dark. The fire has burned down to coals. The smell of the evening soup still lingers in the kitchen. Outside the window, their vineyard, 3 generations of labor and weather, is dormant in the autumn air, the vines cut back for winter, the earth cold and patient. The youngest child is breathing in the way small children breathe in deep sleep, with a profound animal regularity that is one of the most peaceful sounds in the world. The parents are in the first sleep, or have already passed through the midnight waking and returned to the second. Their bodies, worked hard all day, are doing what worked bodies do, rebuilding, restoring, preparing for another day. On a frigate somewhere in the Bay of Biscay, on a course for Cadiz with a moderate wind from the northwest, the watch is being changed. The officer of the watch is a young lieutenant who has been awake for 6 hours, and his relief has just come on deck, and the handover of information, wind, course, weather, the state of the ship, is happening in the efficient shorthand of sailors who understand each other's fatigue. In a few minutes, the young lieutenant will descend to his cabin and lie down on his bunk without removing his coat and be asleep within a minute. He is 23. He is very tired. He will sleep for 4 hours and then do it again. In Philadelphia, in a modest brick house on a street that is quiet at this hour though it will be busy again at dawn, a woman sits in a chair by a dying fire and nurses her infant. The infant has been awake more often than either of them would prefer. The woman is in that particular state of exhaustion that new mothers know, not quite awake, not quite asleep, her attention split between the feeding infant and the internal drift toward unconsciousness that is always pulling at her. When the infant sleeps, she will sleep too, right there in the chair if she must. She has learned not to wait for the bed. Sleep comes when it comes, and you take it where you can. And in a great house in the English countryside, in a bedroom that is warm and dark and smells of beeswax and lavender and the very faint ghost of the evening's fire, a man lies awake. He is not anxious, exactly. He is not frightened or grieving or suffering from any of the recognized causes of sleeplessness. He is simply awake, in the way that people sometimes are, without explanation in the deep of the night. He is a man of the Enlightenment. He has read Locke and Newton and Hume. He believes in the daylight that the world is knowable. That reason is adequate to the world's complexity, that the great project of understanding is possible and worth the effort. But at this hour, lying in the dark, he is not certain of any of it. The certainty that feels so solid in the afternoon dissolves a little in the long quiet of the night. The arguments that seemed airtight become porous. The questions that seemed answered turn out to have loose ends that the nighttime tugs at. He does not find this frightening. He finds it interesting. He lies in the dark and thinks about consciousness, about what is happening in his mind right now, the thoughts arising and passing, the associations forming and dissolving, the strange way the self seems both present and distant in these nighttime hours. He thinks about the philosophers he has read, their careful arguments about the nature of the mind, the nature of knowledge, the nature of the self. And he thinks, I don't know, not really. Despite everything, I don't know. This is, perhaps, the most honest thought the Enlightenment ever had, the deepest quiet of the ambient, barely sound at all, just the very faint suggestion of breath and the distant tick of a clock and the almost imperceptible whisper of the world turning. The deep of the night is, for the Enlightenment as for every other age, the hour when certainty rests and uncertainty keeps watch. The age of reason was also always an age of doubt. Not the paralytic doubt that prevents action, but the honest doubt that keeps the mind honest, that refuses to allow the comfort of easy answers to substitute for the difficulty of real ones. The philosophers knew this. The best of them said so, explicitly. Hume's willingness to follow his arguments to their unsettling conclusions, to acknowledge that cause and effect could not be proven, that the self was not a stable, continuous thing but a bundle of impressions, that certainty was harder to come by than we like to think, was not intellectual timidity. It was intellectual courage, the courage to say, I don't know, and to keep looking anyway. And in the deep of the night, lying in the dark, even the most confident minds of the age came up against the limits of what they knew. Sleep itself was one of those limits. For all the treatises and theories and careful observations, sleep remained mysterious. You could describe it from outside. You could measure its effects and characterize its conditions and recommend its proper management. But the thing itself, the going away, the being somewhere else, the return, was not something that reason could follow. You had to go there alone. Before the dawn, ambient, the very beginning of a change, not yet light, not yet birdsong, but something shifting in the quality of the darkness, a barely perceptible loosening in the last hours before dawn, something changes in the quality of sleep. The physiologists of the 18th century noted it. The poets noticed it too. The diarists, when they recorded their nights, often described this final phase differently from the rest, lighter, more dream-rich, closer to the surface of waking. We know now that this is the period when REM sleep predominates, the phase of sleep most associated with vivid dreaming, with the rapid movement of the eyes beneath their closed lids, with the brain activity that paradoxically resembles wakefulness more than it resembles the deep, quiet stages that came earlier in the night. The 18th century did not have this vocabulary, but it had the experience. The dreams of the pre-dawn hours were different from those of midnight. They were closer, more coherent, more emotionally legible, more easily remembered after waking. And they could be in these last hours before the day demanded its resumption, almost pleasant to lie within that state of knowing, somewhere at the very edge of consciousness, that you are dreaming, and that the dream is doing its strange work, and that in a little while you will wake. The dawn was announced differently in different places and by different signals. In the country, the birds were first. The dawn chorus, that extraordinary, somewhat mad eruption of song that begins well before the first light and builds through the early morning to peak around sunrise, was the most reliable and the most beautiful of alarm clocks. The robin typically began first, in the English countryside, in the deep dark before the sky had shown any sign of changing. Then the blackbird. Then a cascade of others, wren, thrush, chaffinch, lark, until the air was full of a sound that was both individual and collective, each bird singing its own song and all the songs together becoming something different from any of them. Country people woke to this. They had woken to it all their lives. The dawn chorus was not an intrusion or an alarm. It was a signal that the night had passed, that the day was available, that the body's long rest was complete, and the world was ready to be worked again. In the cities, the birds were supplemented by human sounds. The church bells, ringing the canonical hours, had marked the night at regular intervals, and now they marked the morning, ringing prime, the first hour of the day, at whatever time the particular community assigned to it. In England, the watchman, the person hired by the parish to walk the streets through the night and call the hours, was an institution that persisted through much of the 18th century, and his morning call was another signal of the night's end. The market towns and cities had their own sounds of first light, the cartwheel on the cobblestones as the market traders arrived before dawn to set up their stalls, the clatter of the dairy, where the morning's milk was prepared for distribution. The fire lighter who went from house to house in some wealthy neighborhoods, laying and lighting the kitchen fires so that the household would find warmth ready when they woke. The night's long quiet resolved in these sounds back into the day's activity. The pendulum had swung as far as it went. Now it was returning. The first hint of birdsong in the ambient, very faint, very distant. A single note, repeated, then joined by another. The morning waking was attended by its own rituals, as we have seen. But there is something worth noting about the quality of the waking itself, the particular state of consciousness that the 18th century shared with us and with every age that has ever experienced a morning. You are not quite yourself when you first wake. The self that went to sleep, that particular arrangement of memories, worries, intentions, relationships, and ongoing concerns that constitutes a human being at a particular moment in time, has to reassemble itself each morning from the dispersal of sleep. This takes time, a few seconds, a few minutes. The room comes back, the awareness of your body comes back, the knowledge of who you are and what day it is and what is expected of you comes back. During this interval, this brief, recurring amnesia of the newly woken, you are, temporarily, less than your usual complicated self. You are simpler, more open. You are in a state that some traditions have valued for its clarity, and others have found alarming for the same reason. The Enlightenment noticed this state. The philosophers who were interested in the nature of personal identity and consciousness were very interested in the morning waking as a phenomenon, because if the self was constituted by memory and continuity, as Locke argued, then the morning waking was a moment when that continuity was briefly interrupted, and the self had to reconstitute itself from the available materials. This reconstitution was usually seamless and apparently effortless, but it was not actually effortless. The brain was doing something in those first seconds, matching the immediate sensory data of the waking room to the stored context of the life being lived, confirming the identity, resuming the story. Most of the time, this worked perfectly. The room was the expected room. The body was the expected body. The morning was the expected morning, following from the night that followed from the day that followed from the week that followed from the life. Occasionally, it failed briefly, and then you had the disorienting experience of waking and not knowing for a few seconds where you were, which was common enough if you were sleeping in an unfamiliar place, or waking from a particularly immersive dream, or waking after a night of interrupted, fragmented sleep. And in that brief failure, in the second or two before the context assembled, there was something interesting, a glimpse of consciousness without story, awareness without narrative. Just the raw experience of being here, in a body, in a room, in a morning, without yet knowing what any of it meant. The philosophers of the Enlightenment found this glimpse fascinating and slightly vertiginous. The poets found it beautiful. The ordinary person, waking in an ordinary room, reaching toward the assembled self of their daily life, probably found it barely noticeable. And then it was over. The day began. The candles were lit. The fire was rekindled. The night receded. A letter written before sleep, ambient, quieter now, back to the study. A single candle, the last half-inch of it, and outside the wind has stilled completely, and the city has reached its deepest nighttime quiet. Let us end with a letter. Not a famous letter. Not a letter from one of the great names of the century. Not from Voltaire or Hume or Montagu or Franklin. A letter from someone quieter. Someone whose name has not survived in the histories, but whose words, preserved by some accident of archives and careful scholarship, reach us across 3 centuries with a vividness that the famous letters sometimes lack. It is a letter written by a woman, a physician's wife, in a market town in the English Midlands, somewhere in the 1770s. She is writing to her sister, who lives in a town some 40 miles away and whom she sees perhaps twice a year. They are close. The letter is warm and specific, full of the kind of detail that comes from long familiarity. The address is tender and teasing at once. The letter is undated, but she writes in it that it is late, past 10, she thinks, though she does not have a clock in the room where she is writing and can only judge by the length of the candle she's been burning and by the quality of the silence outside. Her husband is already asleep. She can hear him, the particular deep, rhythmic breathing of someone in the first, deepest phase of sleep, from where she sits at the writing table in the corner of the bedroom. She is writing by the light of a single candle, careful not to wake him. She writes about the day, about the garden. She has been planting bulbs for the spring, and her hands are still a little dirty despite washing, and she keeps having to wipe them on her apron before she touches the pen. About the children, the oldest has a cold, nothing serious, but he is fractious, and she has been up several times in the night this week to settle him, and she is tired in a way that goes below the ordinary tiredness of a day's work. She writes about the town, the news, the gossip, the weather, the small transactions of a life lived close to its neighbors. And then she writes this: I find myself thinking tonight about sleep in a way I do not usually think about it. I have been so tired this week, and yet sleep keeps sliding away from me, as if it knows I am pursuing it too eagerly and will not be caught. My husband says I am anxious. He is probably right. He usually is about such things, which is partly why I love him and partly why he annoys me. But I think it is more than anxiety. I think it is that I am not ready to stop being here. There is always something else I want to think about, or notice, or do. Sleep feels like a small surrender, and I am a bad loser. She continues for a few more paragraphs, a recipe she wants to share, a question about a mutual acquaintance, the plan for their next visit, and then she closes and folds the letter and seals it. And the candle is now at the very bottom of its wick, and the room is very quiet, and she blows it out. The candle in the ambient goes out, or rather, the quality of the sound shifts to something even softer, even darker. She was right that sleep is a small surrender. Every one of us who has ever lain awake, pursuing sleep and finding it always just out of reach, knows what she meant. The active, attending, engaged self does not go gently into that dark. It wants to stay. It has things to think about, things to notice, one more thing, but the surrender comes eventually. It has always come. It came for the physician in his study in London, still working out his theory of the nerves. It came for the sailor in his hammock, swinging with the ship's motion on dark Atlantic water. It came for the salonnière lying blind in the Paris apartment, the last conversation of the evening still turning in her mind. It came for the farm family in Burgundy, sleeping in the warmth of their winter house. It came for the scholar in Edinburgh with the ink on his cheek. It came for the woman writing by candlelight to her sister, who was tired in a way that went below ordinary. It comes for all of us. For everyone who has ever been tired enough and still enough and dark enough and quiet enough. For you, perhaps tonight. The night that remains, ambient. The softest possible version of everything we have heard, a breath of wind, a distant church bell, an ember, a ship's timber, a field at dawn that is not quite dawn yet, all of it at the very edge of audibility. The Enlightenment ended. Or rather, it did not end so much as it changed shape, became something else, flowed into the Romantic movement and the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of the modern world, carrying its questions with it and leaving some of its answers behind. The two-phase sleep, the segmented night, was one of the things it left behind. Gas lighting in the early 19th century, and then electrical lighting in the later 19th century, pushed back the darkness and extended the evening in ways that disrupted the ancient rhythm. The midnight waking that had been so ordinary, so expected, so unremarkable that it needed no explanation, gradually became rarer and stranger, and eventually became insomnia, a pathology rather than a phase. The cities grew larger and noisier and brighter. The workday became more rigidly defined, the alarm clock appeared, and the flexible, light-following rhythms of the pre-industrial world were replaced by the fixed schedule that continues to govern most modern lives. The physicians lost some of their confidence about what sleep was and gained a great deal of new uncertainty. The neuroscience of the 20th century revealed that sleep was vastly more complicated than the 18th century had imagined, not a simple state of rest, but a dynamic, structured process with multiple distinct phases, each serving different and essential functions, the whole organized by a biological clock of exquisite precision. And the mysteries remained. We know more about sleep now than any 18th century physician could have imagined. And we also know with more precision than before how much we do not know. The questions the Enlightenment asked, what is sleep? Where do we go? What do dreams mean? Why does the night do what it does to us? Are still not fully answered. They may never be. The ambient is now at its absolute softest, barely there, just the faintest breath of everything that has come before. But tonight, all of that is far away. Tonight there is only this, the dark and the quiet and the particular quality of the night's deepest hours, which are the same now as they were in the 18th century, which are the same as they were 1,000 years before that, and which will be the same 1,000 years from now. The darkness comes, the body grows heavy. The mind, which has been so busy, so curious, so determined to follow every thread to its conclusion, begins finally to loosen its grip. The city outside is quiet, the house is quiet. Room is quiet. You have traveled tonight through a world that no longer exists, through rooms and ships and farms and salons and studies, through the dreams and the theories and the remedies, and the contradictions of a century that wanted to know everything and knew in the end that it had only begun. And now, perhaps, you are ready to let it all rest. The Enlightenment's philosophers spent their lives trying to illuminate the dark, trying to bring the light of reason to bear on every corner of human experience. And they succeeded in so many ways. They changed the world. They left us a legacy that shapes every day we live, but they could not illuminate sleep. Sleep remains, will always remain, the place where the light does not follow. You go there yourself. You have always known the way, so let the candle go out, let the room go dark. Let the sounds of the house become part of the sounds of the night, and let the sounds of the night become part of the sounds of the breathing world, and let the breathing world do what it has always done, in every century and every darkness since the first darkness. The philosopher in his study, the sailor in his hammock, the woman writing to her sister by the last inch of a candle, they are all resting now, and there is room in the long quiet of this night for you. The ambient fades to the very edge of silence, not silence exactly, but the sound of something very close to it, a breath, a heartbeat, and then, gently, nothing.